Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The fluorescent lights in the call center hummed with a frequency that burrowed into my skull around 3 in the morning. That's when the building felt most alive, or perhaps most dead, depending on how you looked at it. The vast room of empty cubicles stretched out behind me like a graveyard of abandoned workstations, each computer monitor glowing with a faint blue light that never quite went dark. I was the only living person on the entire 4th floor, manning the overnight customer service line for a medical supply company that apparently had clients who needed catheters and bedpans at ungodly hours. The first call came on a Tuesday in late September. The phone system displayed the number as unavailable, which wasn't unusual for our line. What was unusual was the silence that greeted me when I answered. Not dead air exactly, but something breathing, patient, waiting for me to speak first. I went through my standard greeting, asking how I could help, what account they were calling about. Nothing. Just that slow, measured breathing that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. After 30 seconds, I disconnected, logged it as a wrong number, and tried to shake the feeling that someone had just studied me through the phone line. It happened again 3 nights later. Same unavailable number. Same patient breathing. This time I waited longer, counting the seconds in my head, listening to that rhythmic sound that was almost but not quite mechanical. At 45 seconds, I heard something else. A soft click, like a tongue against teeth, and then a voice so low I almost missed it, suggested that I looked tired tonight. The line went dead before I could respond. The third call came exactly 1 week after the first, during the dead zone between 2 and 4 a.m., when even the highway outside fell silent. This time the voice was clearer, more confident. It told me that I'd worn the same shirt 2 nights in a row, that I should really do my laundry more often, that the coffee I was drinking from the break room was 3 days old and probably tasted like rust. Each observation delivered in a flat, almost mechanical tone that made my skin crawl. I stood up so fast my chair rolled backward and crashed into the cubicle wall behind me. The sound echoed through the empty floor like a gunshot. I walked to the windows that overlooked the parking lot, pressing my face against the cold glass, searching for anything unusual. My car sat alone under a flickering streetlight. The security guard's sedan was parked near the entrance, just like always. Nothing moved except the wind pushing trash across the pavement. But someone was watching me. Someone knew what I was wearing, what I was drinking. I reported it to my supervisor the next day. She listened with the exhausted patience of someone who'd heard every complaint imaginable and found them all equally tedious. She suggested that perhaps I was experiencing stress from the isolation of night work, that the mind could play tricks in the small hours. When I insisted that someone was actually calling me, actually watching me, she agreed to review the phone logs and building security footage. The conversation ended with her recommendation that I consider transferring to day shift. The calls continued with disturbing regularity, 3 times a week, always during my shifts, always from that unavailable number. The voice began offering details that no security camera could capture, that I'd scratched my left forearm through my shirt sleeve at 2:17 a.m., that I'd gotten up to use the bathroom at 1:43 and again at 3:22, that I'd been staring at the same spreadsheet for 40 minutes without actually working on it. I started arriving early, checking every corner of the floor, every cubicle, every shadowy space where someone might hide. I taped over the webcam on my computer. I changed my routine constantly, different break times, different seats, different paths through the cubicle maze. Nothing helped. The caller always knew. The caller always saw. The security guard's name was printed on his uniform shirt. I won't repeat it here, won't give it that power, but everyone just called him by his last name. He was a large man with a face that seemed permanently set in the expression of mild irritation, and he made his rounds past my floor 3 times a night. Always the same times, 11 p.m., 2 a.m., and 5 a.m. He would unlock the stairwell door, walk the perimeter of the floor, check the break room and bathrooms, then leave without a word. Sometimes I caught him looking at me a beat too long, his eyes tracking my movements with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Around the fourth week of calls, I noticed him lingering near my cubicle during his rounds. He would pretend to check doors that didn't need checking, adjust thermostats that were locked behind security panels. Once, I looked up from my screen to find him standing completely still about 20 feet away, half hidden in the shadows between cubicles, just watching me work. When I met his eyes, he smiled, a quick mechanical expression that never reached his face, and continued his patrol. I mentioned this during my next call with my supervisor. That's when I learned about the complaints. 3 women from the day shift had filed reports about him over the past 6 months. Nothing actionable, she explained, but a pattern of uncomfortable behavior, staring, following them to their cars, appearing in hallways where he had no reason to be. The building management was aware, she assured me, and handling it appropriately. 2 days later, he was fired. The news came through the overnight operations group chat. Effective immediately. Terminated for violations of workplace conduct policy. Security would be handled by a new service starting the following week. In the meantime, we were to use extra caution and report any concerns directly to building management. The phantom caller's voice was on my line before I'd finished reading the message. This time it spoke for almost 3 minutes. It described the layout of my apartment in perfect detail. The water stain on my bedroom ceiling, the broken vertical blind in my living room, the way I'd arranged my shoes in a neat row by the door. It mentioned the book I'd left on my nightstand, open to page 247. It asked if I'd enjoyed my lunch yesterday, the leftover Chinese food I'd eaten cold, straight from the container while standing at my kitchen counter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I tried to speak, to demand who this was, how they knew these things, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The caller seemed to sense my distress and made that same clicking sound with its tongue, almost sympathetic, before the line went dead. I filed a police report the next morning. The officer who took my statement had tired eyes and the patient air of someone who'd heard variations of this story countless times. He wrote everything down, made appropriate noises about taking it seriously, and explained that without explicit threats or evidence of stalking, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I change my phone number, my locks, maybe stay with a friend for a few days. Then he closed his notepad and told me to call if anything escalated. That night, I came to work armed with a flashlight, a can of pepper spray, and a determination to find proof of whoever was watching me. I arrived an hour early and searched every inch of the 4th floor. I checked ceiling tiles, looked behind printers and filing cabinets, examined every corner where a camera might hide. I found nothing but dust, dead insects, and the accumulated detritus of an office building that had seen better decades. The calls stopped. 3 nights passed without a single mysterious call. Then a week. Then 2. The new security service sent different guards each night, none of whom paid me any attention beyond a professional nod during their rounds. My supervisor sent an email asking if the situation had resolved itself. The police never followed up. Slowly, gradually, I began to convince myself that it was over. The fired security guard had been the caller. It made sense. He had access to the building, to the security footage. He could have followed me home, learned my routines, studied my habits. His termination had ended the harassment. Case closed, except on the 14th night after the call stopped, I found something taped under my desk. A small digital voice recorder, the kind you could buy at any electronics store. My hands were steady as I pulled it free, steadier still as I pressed play. My own voice filled the empty cubicle, recorded over countless hours. Every phone call I'd taken, every muttered curse at my computer, every time I'd sung quietly along to music in my headphones. Hours and hours of my life, captured and preserved. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the recording was still running. The red light was on. And when I checked the timestamp, it showed that the device had only been activated that morning, hours after I'd left for the day. Someone had been here today. Someone had placed this here, recently, specifically for me to find. I played the recording backward, my stomach turning as I recognized the sounds of my apartment. The creak of my bedroom floor, the distinctive rattle of my bathroom cabinet, the low hum of my refrigerator, all recorded in the early hours of the morning, long after I'd left for work. That's when I understood. The guard had been fired for harassing women during the day shift, but I worked nights. I was male. Why would he have targeted me? Why would he have known such intimate details about my home? I rewound the recording further, listening to older segments. There were sounds I didn't recognize. Footsteps in my apartment when I knew I'd been alone. The soft rustle of someone moving through my bedroom while I slept. Breathing, that same patient, measured breathing from the phone calls, right next to my bed. My supervisor had been right about one thing. The mind does play tricks in the small hours, but sometimes those tricks are the only warning you get that reality has shifted beneath you, that the world you thought you knew has revealed itself to be something thinner, more permeable than you'd believed. The security guard disappeared the same day he was fired. His car was found abandoned at a rest stop 40 miles north, keys still in the ignition, wallet and phone left on the passenger seat. The police investigated it as a possible suicide, though no body was ever found. The story made the local news for exactly one day before being buried under more pressing concerns. I wanted to believe he'd been the caller. I needed to believe it, because the alternative was worse. The alternative suggested that someone else had been watching all along, that the guard's harassment of those other women had been separate, coincidental, that his disappearance wasn't an escape, but something else entirely. I sit here now, 3 months later, still working the overnight shift because I'm too stubborn or too stupid to leave. The calls haven't resumed. The voice recorder sits in an evidence bag at a police station somewhere, though I never heard back about any investigation. The new security guards make their rounds and never linger. Everything is normal. Everything is fine. Except sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I feel the weight of attention on my shoulders. I catch movement in my peripheral vision that vanishes when I turn my head. I hear that same soft clicking sound, barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights and computer fans. And last week, I came home to find my apartment exactly as I'd left it. Everything in its proper place, nothing missing or disturbed. But the book on my nightstand had been moved. Just slightly, just enough to notice. It was now open to page 248. Someone is still watching, someone is still waiting. And the most terrifying part is that I'm no longer certain they ever needed to be in the building at all. Maybe the phone calls were never about technology or access or security cameras. Maybe they were about something else entirely, something that doesn't need doors or windows or physical presence to see everything, to know everything, to be everywhere you are and everywhere you've ever been. The guard might have been the caller, or he might have been just another person who felt that attention, who recognized that weight, who understood too late that some things can't be escaped or explained or reported to indifferent authorities. I don't know if he ran away or if something took him. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if my mind is the only thing still holding the world together in a shape that makes sense. I don't know if the voice on the phone was ever human, or if it was something wearing human sounds like an uncomfortable costume. What I know is this: I'm being watched. I've always been watched. And somewhere in the static between sleeping and waking, between reason and madness, something is patiently waiting for me to understand what it wants. The phone on my desk just lit up. Unavailable number. 3:47 a.m. I'm going to answer it. Story 2. The call came through my radio at 2:47 a.m., crackling with that particular quality of static that always made the hairs on my neck stand up during the dead hours. Dispatch said a resident advisor from Becker Hall reported a student hadn't returned to his room, and someone thought they'd seen a figure near Kaufman Hall's west entrance around midnight. I was to check the perimeter, make sure all access points were secure, nothing more. Kaufman Hall had been closed for renovations since August, though no construction crew had touched the building in the 3 months I'd been working campus security. The place just sat there on the edge of the quad, its brick facade darkening with each passing season, windows reflecting nothing but the sodium lights from the pathways. Administration had been vague about when work would begin. Budget concerns, they said. Structural assessments, the usual bureaucratic fog. I approached from the south side, my flashlight cutting through the October mist that rolled across the dead grass. The building loomed larger than I remembered, 6 stories of early 20th century institutional architecture, all hard angles and small windows. My boots crunched over gravel, loud in the pre-dawn silence. Everything was quiet. Everything was locked. I should have called it in right then. Should have radioed that the perimeter was secure and returned to my patrol route, but something made me circle the building one more time. My light playing across the foundation, the ground-level windows with their painted-over glass, the heavy doors with their chains and padlocks. That's when I noticed the west entrance. The chain hung loose, one end dangling against the doorframe. The padlock lay in the dead leaves at the threshold, open. Not broken, not cut, just open, as if someone had used a key. My supervisor had told me during training that only 3 keys existed for Kaufman. One with the facilities director, one with the head of campus security, and one in the emergency lockbox at the main office. I knew because I'd asked about it specifically after hearing stories from the other guards. Stories they told during the slow hours between midnight and dawn, about sounds from the empty building, about lights seen moving behind the painted windows, about the 4th floor that had been sealed off years before the rest of the building was closed. I pushed the door open. It moved smoothly, silently, on hinges that shouldn't have been that well maintained. The smell hit me immediately. Mildew and dust? Yes, but underneath something else, something sharp and chemical, like industrial cleaner or antiseptic. My flashlight revealed a lobby stripped of furniture, walls showing patches where bulletin boards had been removed, floor tiles cracked and lifting at the corners, but no footprints in the dust. The layer of grime on everything looked undisturbed. I called out, my voice echoing up the stairwell. Protocol demanded I announce myself, though every instinct screamed to leave, to seal this place back up and forget I'd ever seen that open lock. No response came except my own words bouncing back from the upper floors, distorted and hollow. The first 3 floors yielded nothing. Empty hallways, empty rooms, everything stripped and abandoned. But the dust remained pristine, unmarked. If someone had entered this building, they'd left no trace. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the open lock, if exhaustion was playing tricks after 6 straight nights on shift. The stairwell to the 4th floor was different. A chain had been drawn across it, attached to hooks on either side, and a sign hung from the center. Structural hazard. No access by order of facilities management. The chain was newer than the rest of the building's hardware, installed recently enough that the metal still gleamed in my flashlight beam. That's when I heard it. A sound from above, from somewhere beyond the chain barrier. Not quite footsteps, more like weight shifting on old floorboards. Then silence, stretching out for 10, 15, 20 seconds. Just as I convinced myself I'd imagined it, the sound came again, clearer this time. Definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor directly above my position. I should have left, should have called for backup, should have done any number of things that a rational person would do. Instead, I unhooked the chain and started climbing. The 4th floor landing opened onto a hallway that looked different from the others. Where the lower floors had been stripped bare, this one retained its original character. Faded carpet runners lined the corridor. Doors still had their room number plates. Emergency lights glowed dimly from battery backup, casting everything in a sickly yellow-green. The chemical smell was stronger here, mixed now with something organic and stale. Every door stood closed except one, near the far end of the hallway. It hung slightly ajar, darkness visible beyond the threshold. My flashlight beam caught something on the carpet between me and that open door, a trail of footprints in the dust, leading away from the stairs and disappearing into the room. The footprints were fresh. I could see the distinct tread pattern, smaller than my own boots. Someone was here, or had been here very recently. I radioed dispatch. keeping my voice low, and reported my location. The response came back distorted, words broken up by static. I thought I heard the dispatcher tell me to evacuate immediately, but the message cut out before I could confirm. I moved down the hallway, following the footprints. The silence pressed against my eardrums, broken only by my own breathing and the subtle groan of the building settling. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. In that moment of darkness, I thought I saw movement from the corner of my eye, a shape retreating around the corridor's bend. But when the lights returned, nothing was there. The open door belonged to what had once been a dorm room. My light revealed 2 bare mattresses, a desk overturned in the corner, walls covered in water damage. And on the far wall, someone had written something. Not graffiti. The letters were too careful, too deliberate, over and over, covering every available surface. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The writing looked recent, the marker ink still dark against the stained plaster. A laugh echoed from somewhere else on the floor. High and brief, cut off abruptly as if someone had clapped a hand over their own mouth. The sound came from deeper in the building, from one of the other hallways that branched off this central corridor. I called out again, identifying myself as campus security, demanding that whoever was present show themselves immediately. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if someone was listening to me, considering their response. Then came the sound of running footsteps, hard and fast, moving parallel to my position in one of the adjacent hallways. I pursued, my flashlight beam swinging wildly as I tried to track the source. The footsteps stayed just ahead of me, turning corners seconds before I reached them, always out of sight. The layout of this floor was more complex than the others, a maze of corridors and alcoves that didn't match the building's exterior dimensions. I found myself in sections I didn't remember entering, passing the same landmarks multiple times. Or were they the same? The emergency lights cast identical pools of yellow-green radiance, making orientation impossible. That's when I heard the laughter again, closer now, coming from directly ahead. I rounded a corner and saw him. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, silhouetted against the faint glow from a window. Tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light. I couldn't make out features, couldn't distinguish any details beyond the basic outline. My flashlight beam couldn't quite reach him. The darkness seemed to deepen around his form, swallowing the light before it could illuminate his face. I ordered him to identify himself, to step forward slowly with his hands visible. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, perfectly still, in a way that no living person stands still. Even at rest, humans shift their weight, adjust their posture, breathe in ways that create subtle motion. This figure possessed the absolute stillness of a photograph. Then it started walking toward me, not running, not rushing, just walking, each step measured and even, closing the distance between us with mechanical precision. I backed up, maintaining the gap, shouting commands that went unheeded. The figure didn't react to my voice, didn't slow its advance. My flashlight beam still couldn't penetrate the darkness around its upper body, couldn't show me a face. I turned and ran. The hallways became a blur, one identical corridor bleeding into another. I could hear him behind me, not running, still just walking, but somehow keeping pace. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold. The emergency lights flickered faster now, creating a strobe effect that turned movement into a series of still frames. I burst through a door and found myself in a common area, larger than the others I'd seen. Couches remained here, arranged in a circle, all facing inward. Someone had left papers scattered across the floor, hundreds of them, covered in dense handwriting. In the stuttering light, I caught glimpses of repeated phrases. Never meant to hurt anyone. They don't understand. Please let me go home. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. The door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, bringing my flashlight up, and finally saw him clearly. He was young, couldn't have been more than 20. Dark hair hung lank around a pale face. His eyes were wrong, too wide, whites visible all around the irises, pupils contracted to pinpoints despite the darkness. He wore what might have once been expensive clothes, now rumpled and stained. When he opened his mouth, no sound came out at first. Then, gradually, building from a whisper to a shriek, he began to scream. The sound wasn't human. It started as a low keen, rising in pitch and volume until it filled the room, vibrating in my teeth, in my bones, in the air itself. He charged, arms outstretched, fingers hooked into claws, still screaming that impossible scream. I don't remember much of what happened next. There was impact, confusion, a moment of struggling where I couldn't tell where he ended and I began. My flashlight went flying, its beam spinning across walls and ceiling. In the darkness, I felt his breath on my face, heard him whispering words I couldn't understand, felt his hands clutching at my uniform. Then I was in the stairwell, stumbling down the steps, not sure how I'd gotten there. Behind me, above me, the screaming continued, echoing down through the building's core. I reached the ground floor and burst through the west entrance into the pre-dawn gray, gasping, my legs nearly giving out as I crossed the dead grass. The sun was rising by the time the other officers arrived. My supervisor found me sitting on a bench across from Kaufman Hall, watching the building's facade catch the morning light. I told him everything, or tried to. The words came out jumbled, out of order, and I could see doubt creeping into his expression even as he nodded along. They searched the building, all 6 floors, including the 4th. They found the open lock, the disturbed dust, even the room with writing on the walls. But no one else. No footprints but my own. No papers scattered in the common area. No signs of any other presence. Later that day, after I'd been sent home to rest, my supervisor called. He suggested, in that careful way administrators have, that perhaps the stress of night shifts had caught up with me. That perhaps I'd experienced a waking dream, a momentary break from reality brought on by exhaustion and isolation. He mentioned that the building had a history of generating such reports, that other guards had experienced similar incidents before the floor was sealed. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought, that there had been an incident years ago involving the son of a former university president. A young man with documented mental health issues who had been found living in the sealed 4th floor of Kaufman Hall, having somehow obtained keys and evaded security for weeks. The university had handled it quietly, kept it out of the press, out of campus records. The father had been a powerful man with powerful connections. They'd thought they'd secured the building after that, thought they'd recovered all the keys. My supervisor told me this story as if it explained everything, as if knowing about the past incident would somehow contextualize my experience, make it less troubling. But he never said what happened to the young man, never confirmed he'd been removed, treated, taken somewhere safe. Just said the incident was resolved years ago, before my time. I've been placed on administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation. Standard procedure, they assure me. Nothing to worry about. In the meantime, Kaufman Hall remains closed, the west entrance newly secured with a heavier chain and a more complex lock. But I drive past it sometimes during the day when the sun makes everything seem normal and rational. And I watch the 4th floor windows, the ones that are supposed to be painted over, impenetrable from inside or out. Sometimes I swear I see movement behind the glass, a shadow passing from one window to another, a pale hand pressed against the pane, and sometimes, in the dead of night when I can't sleep, I wonder whether I actually escaped that building at all. Whether the man in my mirror looks quite like he used to. Whether the screaming I sometimes hear, faint and distant, comes from Kaufman Hall or from somewhere much closer. Whether anyone has checked, really checked, to make sure that what came down those stairs was the same person who went up. Story 3. The alarm panel screamed at 2:47 a.m., pulling me from the thermos-warmed stupor that passed for vigilance during the graveyard shift. Zone 3. The old arts building. Of course it was the arts building. That Victorian relic always found new ways to remind me it didn't want me there. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, leaving the security office's fluorescent sanctuary for the November cold that bit through my jacket the moment I stepped outside. Crichton sprawled before me in the darkness, its scattered buildings like sleeping beasts across the Dumfries landscape. Most of the complex dated back to when this place had been an asylum, back when they called it therapeutic to warehouse the broken and forgotten in stone buildings designed more for containment than care. The arts building stood apart from the others, its 1870s architecture more ornate than the austere blocks that housed patients in their final years. Someone had decided to preserve it, to fill those high-ceilinged rooms with pottery wheels and easels, as if beauty could somehow absolve the walls of whatever they'd witnessed. I'd worked security here for 8 months, and the place had never felt right. Not haunted. I didn't believe in that nonsense, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl whenever I had to check it after dark. My boots crunched across gravel, each step too loud in the November silence. The wind had died completely, leaving the air thick and still despite the cold. I could see my breath, dense clouds that hung suspended before dissipating slowly, as if the darkness itself was reluctant to let them go. The building's entrance loomed ahead, its arched doorway darker than the night around it. I pulled the key from my belt, noting how my hand trembled slightly. Too much coffee, I told myself. Nothing more than too much coffee and too little sleep. The lock turned with a resistance that seemed almost deliberate, metal grinding against metal in a way that set my teeth on edge. The door swung inward, revealing the entrance hall where moonlight filtered weakly through tall windows, creating more shadows than illumination. I stepped inside, and the temperature dropped so suddenly I gasped. Not gradually cooler as one might expect entering a building, but an immediate, shocking plunge that felt less like entering a cold space and more like something cold entering me. The hall stretched before me, its wooden floors polished to a darkness that reflected nothing. During the day, students' artwork lined the walls, cheerful paintings and photographs meant to brighten the space. Now, in the beam of my flashlight, those same images seemed to watch me, their subjects' eyes following my progress with an attention that couldn't be explained by simple pareidolia. I checked my radio, confirming it was on. The static that greeted me when I pressed the talk button sounded wrong. Not the clean crackle of electronic interference, but something that seemed to carry texture, almost like whispered words buried beneath the noise. I released the button quickly. Zone 3 was upstairs. The motion sensor that had triggered the alarm sat at the end of the second-floor hallway, covering the entrance to what had once been, according to the building plans I'd studied during orientation, something called the observation room. They'd converted it into a storage space for art supplies now, but the original purpose remained unclear. Observation of what? The question had nagged at me since I'd first seen those plans, though I'd never voiced it to anyone. The staircase rose from the center of the hall, its steps wide and shallow in the Victorian manner. Ornate balusters lined each side, their turned wood posts creating a rhythm that should have been comforting but instead felt like the bars of a cage. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping across each step, checking for... what? I didn't know. Anything that might explain the alarm. Anything that might delay my climb. The first step creaked under my weight, a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. The second step was silent. The third creaked again, but with a different tone, lower and more sustained, as if the wood itself was groaning in protest. I was 5 steps up when I heard it. A crash from above. Not loud, not the explosive violence of something thrown, but heavy and deliberate. The sound of furniture being dragged across a floor, then released to fall. Then another crash and another, each one distinct and purposeful, each one coming from directly above me. I froze, hand tightening around my flashlight until my knuckles ached. My training said to call it in, to wait for backup. But backup was 30 minutes away, and what would I tell them? That I'd heard furniture moving? They'd laugh. Tell me it was the building settling. Tell me I was jumping at shadows. I'd become the guard who couldn't handle an empty building at night. I resumed climbing, each step requiring conscious effort, each movement of my legs feeling less like decision and more like compulsion. The crashes continued above me, and I began to discern a pattern. 3 heavy impacts in quick succession, then silence, then 3 more. Not random, not accidental, intentional. The second floor landing appeared above me, a rectangle of deeper darkness framed by the stairwell's walls. I was 3 steps from the top when the pressure hit me. It started as a sensation in my chest, a tightness that made breathing difficult. Within seconds, it intensified, spreading outward through my torso and limbs, a crushing weight that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not physical pressure. I could still move, still climb, but something else entirely. It felt like presence, like consciousness, like malevolence given form. I reached the landing, and the pressure increased. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the hallway ahead, illuminating the far end where the motion sensor's red light blinked steadily. Nothing moved in that circle of light. Nothing stirred in the shadows beyond it. Yet the pressure continued to build, and with it came something worse. A smell. Not sudden or overwhelming, but gradual, creeping into my awareness like a memory surfacing from deep water. Burning. Not wood or paper, but something organic and wrong. The smell of hair catching fire, of protein breaking down under extreme heat. My stomach churned, and I pressed my sleeve against my nose, but the smell seemed to bypass my physical senses entirely, embedding itself directly into my consciousness. The crashes had stopped. The silence that replaced them felt worse, heavy with expectation. I stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move forward or back, the pressure bearing down on me from all sides. My flashlight beam began to waver, not from trembling hands, but from something else. The light itself seemed to be struggling, dimming and brightening in irregular pulses. That's when I heard the breathing. Not my own ragged gasps, but something else. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations coming from the darkness ahead. Multiple sources, I realized with horror. Not one breath, but many, overlapping and out of sync, creating a rhythm that was simultaneously random and orchestrated. Some breaths were wet and labored, others dry and rasping, all of them distinctly human, yet utterly wrong. My training abandoned me. My rationality fled. I stumbled backward, my heel catching the top stair, and for a moment I teetered on the edge of falling. The pressure surged, no longer just bearing down, but actively pushing, trying to send me backward down the stairs. I could feel it against my chest, against my face, an invisible force with unmistakable intent. Words came unbidden to my lips, fragments of prayers learned in childhood and mostly forgotten. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. The words felt small and inadequate against what pressed upon me, but I spoke them anyway, my voice hoarse and cracking. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. The pressure responded. It didn't lessen. If anything, it intensified. But its quality changed. The crushing weight became focused, concentrated, as if whatever presence filled this space had gathered itself into a single point of furious attention. I felt it move past me, or through me. The distinction seemed meaningless. A current of cold rage that left ice in my veins and spots dancing across my vision. Then it was gone. Not gradually, not fading, but simply absent, as if a switch had been thrown. The pressure vanished. The smell evaporated. The breathing stopped. I stood alone at the top of the stairs, gasping in air that suddenly seemed thin and insufficient. My flashlight illuminating nothing more threatening than an empty hallway and a blinking motion sensor. I should have investigated, should have walked that hallway, checked the rooms, determined what had triggered the alarm. Instead, I retreated. I backed down the stairs, never taking my eyes from the landing above, descended to the entrance hall, and exited the building with movements that were not quite running but weren't quite walking either. Outside, the night air hit me like salvation. I leaned against the building's exterior wall, my legs weak, my hands shaking. The radio on my belt crackled with normal static, and when I checked the time on my watch, I found that only 7 minutes had passed since the alarm had first sounded. 7 minutes. It had felt like hours. I should have called it in, should have reported something. But what could I say that wouldn't make me sound delusional? That wouldn't get me sent for evaluation or fired for being unable to handle the job. I reset the alarm remotely, marked the call as a false trigger on my log, and returned to the security office on legs that barely supported my weight. The rest of the shift passed in a haze of cold coffee and fluorescent light. I avoided looking at the arts building's dark silhouette visible through the office window. When dawn finally broke, washing the grounds in weak November sunshine, I felt no relief. The light seemed unable to penetrate certain shadows, certain corners where darkness pooled and refused to disperse. The day shift guard found me still in the office, still in my jacket, staring at my hands as if they belonged to someone else. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was tired, that it had been a long night, that I was looking forward to going home. All lies. I wasn't tired. The night hadn't been long enough for what I'd experienced, and I knew I wouldn't find rest at home, because what I'd felt in that building had attached itself to me somehow. A memory that was more than memory. An experience that continued to unfold, even in its absence. It was 2 days later when I learned the truth, though truth seems inadequate for what I discovered. I'd been unable to shake the feeling that the building held secrets beyond its apparent history as an asylum arts center. Something about that observation room, about the building's isolated location, about its ornate architecture that seemed too refined for its supposed purpose. I spent my lunch break in the local historical society's archives, searching through documents and photographs. The librarian, a woman whose enthusiasm for local history bordered on obsessive, helped me navigate collections of asylum records that had been donated decades ago. Most were mundane. Administrative paperwork, budget reports, patient statistics rendered anonymous by time and legal requirement. Then I found the architectural surveys. The arts building hadn't been built for arts at all. It had been constructed in 1872 as the asylum's crematorium. Not for the living, obviously, but for the dead. For the patients who died in care, and there had been many in those years, whose bodies required disposal. The building's isolation made sense then. The high ceilings weren't aesthetic choices, but functional requirements for dispersing heat and smoke. The observation room had been where the furnaces were monitored, where temperatures were checked and records kept of what had been committed to flame. The librarian noticed my reaction and mentioned, almost casually, that the crematorium had operated for nearly 40 years before being shut down in the 1910s. Renovations in the 1970s had transformed it into the arts building, though the old furnace room in the basement had simply been sealed off rather than demolished. Too expensive to remove all that ironwork and brickwork, she explained. Easier to just wall it up and pretend it had never existed. I sat in that archive for another hour, staring at architectural drawings that showed a building I'd walked through but never truly known. The second-floor landing where I'd felt that crushing pressure sat directly above what had been the main furnace chamber. The observation room had been exactly that, a place to watch the dead burn, to ensure complete cremation, to manage the machinery of industrial-scale disposal. How many bodies had passed through those furnaces over 4 decades? How many forgotten souls had been reduced to ash in that building's hidden heart? The records didn't say. Some numbers, I realized, were too large or too terrible to preserve. I haven't been back to the arts building since that night. I traded shifts, called in sick, did everything I could to avoid being assigned there. My supervisor noticed, of course, asked if there was a problem with the building. I told him the heating was unreliable, that it was always too cold inside. He laughed and said that was true of all the old buildings, that I should just wear a heavier jacket. But I know the cold I felt wasn't something a jacket could ward off. The pressure I experienced wasn't psychological or imaginary. The breathing I heard wasn't the building settling or my nerves playing tricks. Something in that building remembers what it was, what happened within its walls. Something remains in that space where the dead were systematically erased, where flesh and bone were transformed into nothing, where the unwanted disappeared into smoke and ash. Or perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps it was nothing more than fatigue and fear, an overactive imagination fed by darkness and solitude. Perhaps the crashes were structural settling, the pressure a panic attack, the smell a trick of old ventilation systems. Perhaps I ran from shadows and prayed to combat my own weakness. I don't know which explanation frightens me more. What I do know is this. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the security office, I catch myself watching the arts building's dark silhouette. And sometimes, though it might be nothing more than reflection or illusion, I see lights moving in those second-floor windows. Not the steady glow of electrical fixtures, but flickering, dancing lights that pulse and fade like flames behind glass. I never investigate those lights. I log them as external reflections, as car headlights from the distant road, as anything except what they might actually be. Because I remember the pressure on those stairs. I remember the malevolence I felt, the sense of being unwanted, of trespassing on ground that belonged to something else. I remember the breathing, multiple and wrong, human and inhuman. And I remember that my prayer to Saint Michael didn't banish what pressed upon me. It only drew its attention, only made it notice me in a way it hadn't before, made me visible to something that, until that moment, had been content to simply exist in that space, to move furniture in empty rooms, to remember in its own way what had once filled those halls. Now sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I feel that same pressure returning. Not in the building. I've managed to avoid going back, but elsewhere. A tightness in my chest as I drive home, a weight on my shoulders as I lie in bed, a presence at the edge of my awareness that I can never quite see but know is there. Watching, waiting, remembering. The day shift guard told me yesterday that the arts building's alarm has been triggering regularly, always in the middle of the night, always from Zone 3. Always while I'm off duty, he said with a laugh, as if that was fortunate for me. He asked if I'd had any trouble with it before. I told him no. Another lie to add to my collection. I handed in my resignation this morning. My supervisor asked why, if it was the pay or the hours or something that could be addressed. I told him I'd found something better, something with more opportunity. One final lie. The truth is, I'm running. Running from whatever I felt in that building, from whatever noticed me when I spoke those desperate prayers. Running from the knowledge that some places remember, that some histories cannot be renovated away, that some presences remain long after their purpose has been sealed behind walls and forgotten. But as I drove away from Crichton for the last time, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the arts building receding into the distance. And in its second-floor windows, in the gray light of a Dumfries afternoon, I saw movement. Just for a moment. Just long enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about what was real and what was imagined, about what stays buried and what refuses to remain still. I didn't stop driving. I haven't stopped since. But the pressure follows, a weight I can feel even now as I write this, a presence that seems to have attached itself to me like ash on skin, impossible to completely wash away. I tell myself it's trauma, that the mind can play powerful tricks, that what I experienced can be explained by stress and isolation and the power of suggestion. I tell myself that buildings don't remember, that the dead don't linger, that prayers don't draw attention, but rather provide comfort. I tell myself many things, but late at night, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I hear that breathing again. Multiple sources, overlapping and wrong, coming not from any direction but from everywhere at once. And I know with a certainty that transcends logic or reason that something noticed me in that building. Something that had been content to simply exist became aware of my presence, my intrusion, my desperate invocation of divine protection. And now it remembers me as clearly as I remember it. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether what I experienced was real. The question is whether I'll ever truly escape from it, or whether certain thresholds, once crossed, can never be recrossed in the opposite direction. Whether some awareness, once gained, can ever be forgotten. Whether some presences, once acknowledged, can ever again be denied. I don't have answers. Only the weight that grows heavier each night. Only the breathing that grows louder in the silence. Only the certainty that something changed in that building, at the top of those stairs, when I spoke those ancient words of protection. Something changed, and I cannot change it back. Story 4. The fluorescent lights in the converted wing had always hummed with a frequency that set my teeth on edge. 3 months into this security job at St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, and I still hadn't gotten used to the way sound traveled through the old psychiatric building. The administration called it historic preservation when they repurposed the 1800s structure, keeping the original bones while gutting the interior for modern medical use. What they didn't mention in the orientation was how the walls seemed to hold on to echoes long after the source had vanished, or how the heating system produced sounds that could almost pass for breathing. My rounds through the converted wing were always saved for last. The newer sections of the hospital had that sterile, predictable quality that made security work straightforward. But this place, with its high ceilings and aged woodwork, demanded attention. Every shadow needed investigation. Every sound required confirmation. It was approaching 2 in the morning when I pushed through the heavy door into the east corridor of what had once been the psychiatric ward. The hospital had converted this section into administrative offices and storage, but the original architecture remained intact. Thick doors lined both sides of the hallway, each with a small window reinforced with wire mesh, a remnant from when troubled patients had occupied these rooms. Most remained locked now, holding nothing more sinister than file boxes and outdated equipment. Except tonight, every single door stood wide open. I stopped in the threshold, my hand instinctively moving to the radio clipped to my belt. The corridor stretched before me in a perfect symmetry of gaping doorways, each one revealing the darkness within. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The silence felt thick, almost physical, pressing against my eardrums with an uncomfortable weight. Protocol dictated that I investigate. Protocol also dictated that I call for backup when something seemed off. But what would I report? That someone had propped open a bunch of storage rooms? That I felt uncomfortable in the old psych ward at 2 in the morning? My supervisor, Brennan, would write it off as new guy jitters, just like he'd dismissed the concerns of every other officer who'd mentioned the strange occurrences in this wing. I stepped forward, and my boots echoed against the worn linoleum. The sound repeated down the hallway, bouncing off the open door frames in a stuttering rhythm that didn't quite match my footsteps. I paused, and the echo continued for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The first room contained nothing unusual. Cardboard boxes stacked against the far wall, a metal shelving unit, the lingering smell of old paper and dust. The door had been propped open with a wooden wedge, the kind maintenance used when moving equipment. I kicked it aside and let the door swing shut, the latch clicking with a finality that should have been reassuring. The second room was the same. Another wedge, another door left deliberately open. Someone on the maintenance crew must have been moving supplies and gotten lazy about closing up afterward. That had to be it. By the fourth room, I'd found all the wedges lined up inside, arranged in a neat row against the baseboard. The doors had been propped with something else, or nothing at all. They simply stood open, as if held by an invisible hand that released them the moment I approached. At the end of the corridor sat a wheelchair. It faced away from me, positioned directly in the center of the hallway, as if someone had carefully measured the distance from each wall. The vinyl seat reflected my flashlight beam in a dull gleam. Empty, motionless, but somehow expectant, like it had been waiting for me to arrive. I approached slowly, the radio in my hand now, thumb hovering over the call button. The wheelchair didn't move. Of course it didn't move. Why would it move? But the certainty that it was about to, that any second it would roll forward or spin around, crept up my spine with icy fingers. When I reached it, I grabbed the handles and felt the cold metal bite into my palms. Real, solid, just a wheelchair someone had left behind. I maneuvered it to the side, parking it against the wall where it wouldn't block the corridor. As I released the handles, one wheel spun lazily, producing a rhythmic squeak that echoed down the empty hallway, long after the rotation should have stopped. I closed every door I passed on my way out, checking twice that the latches caught. The sound of my own breathing seemed too loud in the confined space, each exhale visible in the chill that had settled into the corridor despite the hospital's heating system. When I glanced back before exiting, all the doors remained shut. exactly as they should be. The incident report took 10 minutes to file. Unsecured doors in the east wing, possible maintenance issue. Recommend checking door mechanisms. Brennan would read it in the morning, probably grumble about the hospital's aging infrastructure, and nothing would change. That's how it always went. The former pediatric ICU had been relocated to the modern wing 5 years ago, leaving this section of the third floor in a state of bureaucratic limbo. Too expensive to renovate, not decrepit enough to condemn, it existed in that gray space where forgotten things accumulated. The hospital used it for overflow storage now, and occasionally for training purposes when they needed a realistic environment for new nurses. My radio crackled at 2:47 a.m. A nurse on the second floor had called in a missing patient, possible pediatric, wandering near the old children's ward. I acknowledged the call and headed for the stairs, already knowing what I'd find. Nothing. It was always nothing. This was the fourth such call in 6 weeks. Each time, a staff member reported seeing a small figure near the old ICU, always in peripheral vision, always gone when they turned to look directly. Each time, security would respond and find the area empty. No missing patients, no unauthorized visitors, no children anywhere in the building except those properly checked into the current pediatric ward. The third floor hallway stretched before me in dim emergency lighting. The old ICU occupied the far end, marked by double doors that had been propped open with a rolling cart. I could see partway into the space beyond, the ghostly shapes of covered equipment, the glint of stainless steel, the dark squares of observation windows that once allowed staff to monitor critically ill children without entering the room. My footsteps slowed as I approached. The temperature had dropped noticeably, enough that my breath misted in front of my face. The heating system on this floor had been running reduced capacity since the unit closed, but this felt more pronounced than usual. I pulled my jacket tighter and keyed my radio to report my location. Static answered. I tried again, adjusting the frequency, but received only white noise in response. The radios sometimes had dead zones in the older parts of the building. Something about the construction materials interfering with the signal. I'd have to check in once I cleared the area and moved back into range. The old ICU was exactly as I'd seen it on previous calls. Empty beds stripped of linens, monitoring equipment covered in sheets. The medication carts had been removed long ago, leaving rectangular shadows on the faded linoleum. Nothing moved, no sounds except the settling of the building and the distant hum of machinery from the occupied floors below. I swept my flashlight across each corner, checking behind the beds and inside the small isolation rooms that branched off the main ward. Standard procedure. Nothing to find because there was nothing to find. Just another false alarm triggered by shadows and suggestion, and the kind of pattern seeking that makes people see faces in random noise. Except there was a smell. Subtle but distinct, not the antiseptic sharpness of a working hospital or the musty odor of neglect. This was sweeter, almost pleasant. Baby powder, or something very close to it. Fresh enough that it couldn't be residual from 5 years ago, but present enough to be unmistakable. I stood in the center of the ward, turning slowly, trying to locate the source. The scent seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, saturating the air without a discernible point of origin. My rational mind supplied explanations. Someone had stored toiletries nearby. Maintenance had used a scented cleaner. The ventilation system was pulling air from the current pediatric wing. All reasonable, all possible. None of them felt true. Movement caught my eye. Not direct movement, but the sense of something having just shifted in my peripheral vision. I spun toward it, flashlight beam slicing through the darkness to illuminate an empty corner. When I turned back, the same sensation occurred behind me. And again, always just beyond the edge of my vision, always vanishing when confronted directly. My pulse hammered in my ears. I backed toward the exit, keeping my light moving in wide arcs, refusing to turn my back on any section of the room for more than a second. The smell of baby powder grew stronger, cloying now, mixing with something else underneath. Something metallic and cold that reminded me of old pennies. I was 3 steps from the door when I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A sound like wheels rolling across linoleum, coming from deeper in the ward, from the isolation rooms I'd just checked. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. I didn't run. Running would mean acknowledging something that my mind refused to accept. Instead, I maintained a brisk, professional pace back to the corridor, documenting the all clear in my mental log. No missing patients, no unauthorized personnel, no reason to return to that ward for the rest of my shift. My radio crackled back to life as I descended the stairs. The nurse confirmed the patient had been found, confused elderly individual who'd wandered from geriatrics, nowhere near the old ICU. They thanked me for checking and apologized for the confusion. Standard procedure. Everything normal. I didn't mention the smell or the sounds or the movement in my peripheral vision. Those details would only complicate the paperwork and earn me a reputation as someone who spooked easily. Better to file it away with all the other small wrongnesses that accumulated during night shifts in the old wing. The psychiatric evaluation unit occupied the basement level, a necessary evil in a hospital this size. Most patients came through the ER, stayed for observation, and transferred to specialized facilities within 72 hours. It was rare for them to remain longer, and even rarer for them to cause any real trouble. The staff down there knew how to handle escalations. They didn't need security except for the occasional welfare check. Tonight's visit was routine. One of the nurses had requested an extra presence during her rounds, citing an agitated patient who'd been making threatening statements. Not uncommon for someone in acute crisis, but enough to warrant another set of eyes on the situation. The patient occupied a private observation room at the end of the unit. Through the reinforced window, I could see a thin man in hospital scrubs, mid-30s perhaps, with the kind of intense stillness that suggested coiled energy rather than calm. His eyes tracked the nurse's movements with predatory focus, and even through the glass, I could feel the weight of his attention. The nurse filled me in quietly. Patient had been brought in 2 days ago following a psychotic episode, paranoid delusions, aggressive outbursts, but no history of actual violence. Still, his statements were becoming more specific, more targeted. He'd been making predictions about staff members, personal details he shouldn't have known. Lucky guesses mostly, the kind of thing a perceptive person could piece together from observation and context clues. I took up position outside the room while the nurse conducted her check. Standard procedure, just presence, nothing confrontational. The patient's eyes shifted to me immediately, tracking from my face to my uniform to the name tag clipped to my chest. His expression changed. Not fear or anger, but something closer to recognition. When the nurse emerged, she looked unsettled. The patient had asked specifically about me, wanted to know if I was ready for tomorrow, if I'd prepared for what was coming, if I understood what the building wanted. Typical paranoid rambling, I told her. Nothing to worry about. But the patient's words echoed in my mind as I completed my rounds. Ready for tomorrow. What the building wanted. My shift ended at 6 a.m. I'd filed my reports, checked out with the overnight supervisor, and was halfway to my car when Brennan called me back inside. He wore the kind of expression that suggested good news delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. The promotion I'd applied for 3 weeks ago had been approved. Starting tomorrow night, I'd be supervising the security team for the entire hospital complex. Congratulations, well deserved. Report for training at 6 p.m. I thanked him, accepted the handshake, and tried to ignore the cold weight settling in my stomach. The patient had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known about a promotion that hadn't been finalized until this morning. A decision made by administrators who had no contact with the psychiatric unit. Information that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone, let alone a patient in acute crisis. Coincidence? Had to be. Or the patient had overheard something, picked up on some administrative gossip that made its way down to the basement level. Hospitals were full of rumors. People talked. Information leaked. Nothing paranormal about good guesswork. The sun was rising as I drove home, painting the city in shades of orange and gold. I should have felt excited about the promotion. Instead, I felt watched. Even in my car, even in daylight, the sensation persisted, like something had followed me out of the building, attaching itself to my shoulder where I couldn't quite see it. I slept poorly that day. waking every few hours to the phantom sound of wheels rolling across linoleum and doors opening in empty hallways. When my alarm finally pulled me fully awake at 4 p.m., I found myself dreading the return to St. Catherine's with an intensity that bordered on irrational. The evening briefing introduced me to the other security officers on the night shift. Most were veterans who'd worked the hospital for years. They offered congratulations on my promotion with the weary politeness of people who'd seen too many supervisors come and go. One officer, an older man named Hutchinson, pulled me aside afterward. He'd worked the East Wing patrol before me, he explained, before he requested reassignment to the main building. No particular reason, he was quick to clarify. Just preferred the busier sections. More action, less time spent alone in empty corridors. But if I ever needed backup in the old wing, I shouldn't hesitate to call. Some places in the hospital felt different at night. Nothing wrong with acknowledging that. His warning should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something I'd been trying to deny. The hospital had a reputation among its security staff, one that wasn't discussed in official briefings or mentioned in the employee handbook. People who worked here long enough learned which areas to avoid after dark, which corridors produced sounds that had no source, which rooms felt colder than they should. My first supervisory round took me through the main building without incident. The ER was busy but controlled. The surgical wing was quiet. Everything functioned with the smooth efficiency of a well-run hospital. It was only when I approached the converted psychiatric building that the familiar unease returned. Tonight, I wouldn't be making rounds alone. Part of my new responsibilities involved training newer officers, teaching them the patrol routes and emergency procedures. Hutchinson had pulled the night shift with me, and while he'd been less than enthusiastic about revisiting the East Wing, he'd agreed to accompany me through the first complete circuit. We entered the old building together, our footsteps echoing in stereo through the empty administrative corridor. Hutchinson walked slightly ahead, his flashlight cutting through the darkness with practiced efficiency. He knew these hallways better than I did, having worked them for 5 years before his transfer. If anything felt off, he'd notice it first. The east corridor appeared normal. Doors closed. No wheelchair. The fluorescent lights buzzed their usual discordant harmony, and the heating system produced its typical repertoire of groans and hisses. Hutchinson checked each room methodically, confirming locks and documenting conditions in his patrol log. Everything by the book. Nothing unusual. We were halfway through the circuit when Hutchinson suddenly stopped. His entire body had gone rigid, head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I moved closer, about to ask what was wrong, when his hand shot up in a sharp gesture for silence. The building had gone quiet. Not the normal quiet of late night, but an absolute absence of sound that felt unnatural. The fluorescent lights had stopped humming. The heating system had fallen silent. Even our breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. Then I heard it, distant but distinct, the sound of something large and heavy swinging through air. A low whoosh that grew louder with each oscillation, accompanied by the creaking of stressed metal. It came from above us, from one of the upper floors where the old hospital had installed elaborate light fixtures during its initial construction. Hutchinson's face had gone pale. He grabbed my arm, fingers digging in with surprising strength, and pointed toward the ceiling. "The chandelier," he mouthed. "Third floor reading room. We should have called it in. Protocol demanded we report any structural hazard immediately, but Hutchinson was already moving, pulling me along with him, heading not toward the exits but toward the stairs. I tried to pull away, tried to argue that we should evacuate and call maintenance, but he wouldn't release his grip. The third floor reading room had been preserved as part of the hospital's historic wing. The chandelier was original, a massive brass fixture with crystal prisms that had hung there since 1887. It had been reinforced during renovation, certified safe by multiple inspectors. There was no reason for it to be swinging. We burst through the reading room door and found the space apparently empty. The chandelier hung motionless in the center of the high ceiling, its crystals catching the dim emergency lighting in scattered rainbows. Nothing moved. No sounds except our ragged breathing. Hutchinson released my arm and stepped further into the room, his flashlight sweeping across the antique furniture and book-lined walls. I followed more slowly, my attention fixed on the chandelier. It showed no signs of recent movement, no swaying, no indication that it had been anything but perfectly still. That's when I saw him. Hutchinson had stopped directly beneath the chandelier, standing in a shaft of light that seemed to isolate him from the rest of the room. His body had gone rigid again, arms locked at his sides, head tilted back to stare up at the fixture above him. He tried to speak, and I saw his lips move, but no sound emerged. Then the chandelier began to swing, slow at first, barely perceptible, then wider, faster, the ancient chain groaning under the strain. The crystals chimed against each other in a discordant melody that raised the hair on my arms. Hutchinson stood frozen beneath it, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. I lunged forward, grabbed his shoulders, and pulled with all my strength. He didn't budge. It was like trying to move a statue, his body impossibly heavy and rooted to the spot. The chandelier swung wider, its arc bringing the massive fixture within feet of his head with each pass. Time seemed to stretch. I pulled harder, screaming at him to move, to break whatever paralysis held him. The chandelier's momentum increased, and I could hear the chain beginning to separate, individual links popping free with sharp metallic pings. It was going to fall. It was going to crush us both. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, the resistance vanished. Hutchinson stumbled backward, and we both crashed to the floor as the chandelier reached its maximum arc. Above us, the chain gave one final protesting groan and then went still. The swinging stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the fixture hanging motionless once more. We lay on the floor, gasping, staring up at the chandelier that should have killed us. Hutchinson's hands were shaking. So were mine. When he finally spoke, his voice came out hoarse and strained. He told me what he'd felt, something holding him in place. Not physical restraints, but pressure, like hands pressed against his chest and shoulders, keeping him locked beneath the swinging fixture. Like something wanted him there, wanted him to stay until the chain broke. I helped him to his feet. We left the reading room without speaking, without filing a report, without mentioning what had happened to anyone else on staff. What could we say? That an antique chandelier had spontaneously started swinging? That an invisible force had held him in place? That we'd both felt the malevolent intention radiating from a piece of brass and crystal? My shift ended at 6 a.m., just like always, but nothing felt the same. I'd crossed some threshold in that reading room, acknowledged something I could no longer rationalize away. The hospital was alive in ways that had nothing to do with the patients and staff who occupied it during daylight hours. The old psychiatric building remembered its former residents, their anguish and terror and madness soaking into the walls like blood into cloth. As I walked to my car in the early morning light, I thought about the patient in the basement, about his predictions and his strange certainty, about what the building wanted. I dismissed it as delusion, as the paranoid ramblings of a fractured mind. But maybe some forms of madness allowed people to see things more clearly. Maybe the line between psychiatric patient and security guard was thinner than I wanted to believe. Tomorrow night I'd be back, supervising rounds through the converted wing, making my patrol through corridors that rearranged themselves when no one was looking, walking past rooms that held more than just storage boxes and outdated equipment. The hospital needed security after all. Someone had to bear witness to what happened in the dark hours when the modern world fell away and the old building remembered what it used to be. I started my car and pulled out of the parking lot, watching St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital recede in my rearview mirror. The sun had risen fully now, casting the building in warm light that made it look almost benign. But I knew what waited inside, what would still be waiting when I returned tonight and every night after. The question wasn't whether the hospital was haunted. The question was whether I'd end up like the patients it once held, trapped between what I knew to be real and what I couldn't bring myself to accept. Standing beneath a swinging chandelier, held in place by invisible hands, waiting for the chain to break. I merged onto the highway, and in the mirror, I thought I saw a small figure standing in one of the third-floor windows. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. Just reflection and morning light, and the old building keeping its secrets, at least until tonight. Story 5. The fluorescent lights in the media room hummed their monotonous dirge as I loaded the 73rd disc into the duplicator tower. My watch read 1:47 a.m., and the church felt different at this hour, not peaceful like during Sunday services, but hollow, expectant. The pastoral staff had left 6 hours ago, trusting me with the keys and the overnight job of burning 300 copies of the Easter cantata. I'd done this before, plenty of times. Churches always needed someone willing to work the graveyard shift for media projects, and the pay helped with my studio loan payments. The duplicator tower whirred, its 11 drives spinning in mechanical harmony. I stretched my back and decided to check the sanctuary's soundboard one last time before settling in for another 2 hours of mindless disc swapping. The building's heating system had shut off at midnight, and the April chill crept through the walls, making my fingers stiff as I pushed through the heavy sanctuary doors. Darkness swallowed me whole. The sanctuary held space for 400 people, and without the overhead lights, it became a cavern. Emergency exit signs cast weak green rectangles that barely reached past the back pews. I knew the layout well enough. I'd mixed sound here for 3 years, but tonight the familiar space felt wrong. The air tasted stale, thick with the ghost of morning coffee and old hymnal paper. My footsteps echoed too loudly on the carpeted aisle, each one announcing my presence to the empty rows of pews that stretched into shadow. The sound booth sat at the back, elevated behind the last row. I climbed the 3 steps, my hand finding the railing by memory. The board loomed before me, a 40-channel digital console that cost more than my car. I hadn't planned to use it tonight. The duplication work didn't require it, but something about the building's stillness made me want to check the levels, ensure everything was properly shut down. Maybe it was professional habit. Maybe it was the irrational need to do something, anything, to fill the pressing silence. I flipped the power switch. The board's LEDs blinked to life, casting blue and amber light across the booth. All channels read 0. Perfect silence. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned to head back to the media room. That's when I heard it, a ceramic sound, distinct and sharp. The unmistakable clink of a mug touching another mug, or perhaps a saucer. It came from somewhere in the sanctuary's center, maybe 20 feet ahead of me, at about pew height. I froze, my hand still on the booth's doorframe. The building settled around me, old wood contracting in the cold, I told myself. Pipes adjusting. Churches made sounds at night. Everyone knew that. I waited, listened. The HVAC system's distant rumble, the barely perceptible hum of the soundboard behind me. Nothing else. I started walking again, faster this time, ready to get back to the bright media room and its normal mechanical sounds. The darkness ahead seemed thicker now, as if the space itself had condensed. My eyes played tricks, suggesting shapes in the peripheral darkness that vanished when I turned to look directly. Clink. Closer this time. To my left, maybe 3 rows in. The sound was too clear, too specific. Ceramic on ceramic. The kind of sound you'd hear at coffee hour after service, when people gathered in fellowship hall, balancing paper plates and conversation. But there was no coffee hour. No people, no mugs. My heart kicked against my ribs. I stopped walking and stared into the darkness where the sound had originated. The emergency exit's green glow barely reached that section, creating more shadow than illumination. I could make out the curved backs of pews, the narrow gaps between them, but nothing else. Nothing that could explain the sound. Professional curiosity warred with growing unease. I'd recorded in dozens of churches, knew their acoustic properties, their tendency to amplify or deaden sound depending on architecture and materials. But this building had carpeted floors, upholstered pews, acoustic ceiling tiles. It deadened echoes. Sounds didn't carry far here, didn't bounce and repeat. Whatever I'd heard had originated from inside the sanctuary. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight. The LED beam cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating dust motes that swirled in complex patterns. I pointed it toward the third pew on the left, swept it slowly across the empty space. Nothing. Bibles in their holders, offering envelopes. Emptiness. Clink, clink. 2 sounds now, rapid succession. 4th pew, right side. My flashlight beam jumped across the aisle, catching the space where the sounds had come from. Still nothing. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Thermal contraction. Maybe metal chair legs in another room. The sound traveling through walls and ducts. Maybe a delayed echo from when I'd walked through earlier, though that made no acoustic sense. I needed to get out of the sanctuary. The media room suddenly seemed like a fortress of fluorescent normalcy, a place where things behaved according to predictable laws. I turned back toward the rear doors. The soundboard's meters were peaking. I stopped, my breath catching. From 30 feet away, I could see the board's VU meters dancing, their LED segments climbing from green through amber to red. All 40 channels, not 1 or 2. All of them. The input meters surged and fell in waves, as if the console was processing massive amounts of audio. But nothing was plugged in. No microphones, no instruments, no playback devices. The channels were completely open, empty, receiving nothing. Yet the meters screamed red. My legs wanted to run. My mind insisted I was seeing wrong, that the low light was creating optical illusions, that I was tired and misinterpreting the LED patterns. I forced myself to walk back to the booth, each step an exercise in overriding instinct. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The meters weren't just active, they were responding to something, rising and falling with rhythm, with pattern, with intention. I reached for the power switch, ready to kill everything and leave. My hand hovered over it. That's when the rumble started. Not a sound at first, a feeling, a vibration that began somewhere deep in the building's foundation and climbed through the walls, through the floor, through my legs and into my chest cavity. The pews rattled, the hanging lights swayed on their chains. The soundboard trembled under my fingers, its meters now pegged completely red, frozen at maximum input. The rumble grew. What had started as a low-frequency vibration became audible, a grinding, groaning sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The sanctuary's darkness pressed inward, and I swear the shadows moved independently of any light source, contracting and expanding like living things. The ceramic clinks erupted in rapid succession now, dozens of them, hundreds, coming from every direction, a cacophony of phantom coffee hour conversation held in the dark. Every instinct screamed at me to flee. I grabbed my keys from the booth's console and ran. My feet pounded down the aisle, the rumbling intensifying with each step. The building itself seemed to protest my departure, groaning louder, shaking harder. Behind me, I heard crashes, not the ceramic sounds, but heavier impacts, as if furniture was being displaced, though I couldn't bring myself to look back. I hit the sanctuary doors at full speed, burst through into the hallway. The rumbling followed me, traveling through the walls. The media room seemed impossibly far away. I sprinted past darkened offices and classrooms, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The disc duplicator tower still glowed in the media room ahead, its normal operation lights promising sanity and explanation. I made it to the doorway and stopped. The tower was empty. All 11 drives stood open, their trays extended. But I'd loaded disk 73. I'd watched it start burning. The drives should be occupied, spinning, their laser mechanisms etching data onto reflective surfaces. Instead, they gaped at me like empty mouths. The rumbling stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It pressed against my eardrums, heavy and expectant. I stood in the doorway, not quite in the media room, not quite in the hall, frozen between the familiar and the impossible. My watch read 1:58 a.m. 11 minutes had passed since I'd entered the sanctuary. Just 11 minutes, though it felt like hours. I couldn't explain the empty drives, couldn't explain the meters or the rumbling or the sounds. Part of me wanted to investigate, to check the building's security footage, to find the rational cause that surely existed, but a deeper part, the part that had evolved over millions of years to recognize danger, knew that staying would be a mistake. I grabbed my coat and laptop bag, left everything else. The duplicator tower, the discs, the half-finished job. I walked quickly to the building's front entrance, my keys rattling in my shaking hand. Behind me, the church remained silent. No rumbling, no ceramic sounds, just silence. I locked the door from outside and stood in the parking lot looking back at the building, every window dark except for the media room, which still glowed with fluorescent light. From this distance, everything looked normal, peaceful, a church at night, exactly as it should be. My phone buzzed, a text from the senior pastor, time-stamped 2:03 a.m. He never stayed up this late. The message was simple. Everything okay there? Security system showed some unusual readings. Can you call? I stared at the text. Unusual readings. So something had registered. Something had happened that triggered alerts. I wasn't imagining it all. But what had the security system actually detected? Vibrations from the rumbling? Audio from the phantom sounds? Or something else? Something the sensors were designed to catch but the human mind wasn't meant to process. I didn't call him back. Instead, I got in my car and drove home through empty streets, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. When I arrived at my apartment, the sky was beginning to lighten with false dawn. I stood in my kitchen and made coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me back in reality. The ceramic mug clinked against the counter when I set it down, and I flinched at the sound. I never went back to finish the job. Sent an email at 8 a.m. explaining I'd had a family emergency, apologizing for leaving the project incomplete. The pastor called twice. I didn't answer. A week later, I received a check for the partial work completed, along with a note saying they'd found the disk duplicator tower still running, all drives full and functioning normally, having successfully burned all 300 copies while apparently unmanned. That was 3 months ago. I've taken other church jobs since then. Different buildings, different systems, different congregations. But I don't do overnight work anymore. And whenever I hear ceramic touching ceramic, in a coffee shop, at a dinner party, anywhere, I find myself listening for what comes next, waiting for the rumble, checking whatever meters are nearby to see if they're reading inputs that shouldn't exist, because I still can't explain what happened that night, can't rationalize it away. The security system recorded something. The disks got burned. The building was locked, empty, secured, all facts that support a rational explanation. But I know what I heard, what I felt, what I saw on those meters. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my studio, I wonder if it had anything to do with the location. If something about that sanctuary, that particular configuration of space and sound, created conditions for what? A phenomenon? A presence? A crack in the wall between what we understand and what we don't? Or maybe, and this is what keeps me awake, maybe it had nothing to do with the church at all. Maybe it was about me, about something I'd become sensitive to, some frequency or dimension I'd accidentally tuned into. Maybe I'd always been surrounded by these sounds, these presences, these impossible meter readings. Maybe I just finally learned to perceive them. I don't know which possibility frightens me more. What I do know is that sound is strange. It travels through air and solid matter. It reflects and refracts. It exists in waves we can measure but never truly see. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, it seems to carry information that wasn't encoded by any human source. The last thing I remember from that night, the detail I couldn't include in my emergency email or explain to anyone, happened as I locked the church door. Just before the pastor's text arrived, I heard it clearly through the heavy wood, emanating from somewhere deep inside the building. One more clink. Just one. And underneath it, barely audible, what might have been a voice. Or many voices, speaking in rhythm with the sound. Words I couldn't distinguish, but whose tone I understood perfectly. They sounded like they were answering a question I'd never asked, or welcoming someone I'd never met, or continuing a conversation that had been interrupted 73 times before. Story 6. The Grandview Hotel smells like 1923. Old carpet fibers, brass polish, and something underneath that might be mildew, or might be time itself. After 3 months on night audit, I've learned that the building breathes differently after midnight. The elevators creak on floors where no one pressed a button. The radiators clank in a rhythm that almost sounds like footsteps. Almost. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and for 8 hours I'm the only person at the front desk of this 15-story monument to a more elegant era. The lobby stretches vast and silent around me. All marble columns and Art Deco fixtures that cast shadows in shapes that weren't there during the day shift. The management assures guests that the hotel maintains its historic charm. They don't mention that historic charm often comes with historic problems. The first time someone mentioned the third floor to me, it was the housekeeping supervisor during my second week. She'd found me reviewing room service charges in the back office and asked if I'd heard anything unusual on the night shift. When I told her no, she seemed almost relieved, then added that I should ignore any calls from the meeting rooms on 3. Engineering has been trying to fix a wiring issue for years, she explained. Sometimes the phones up there just ring themselves. I asked why they didn't just disconnect them. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read and said they'd tried that. The calls continued anyway. That should have been my first warning, but I needed the job. Night differential pay meant I could finally afford to move out of my brother's basement, and the work itself wasn't demanding. Print reports, process late check-ins, respond to guest requests. Most nights I spent reading or studying, the silence broken only by the ancient elevator machinery and the occasional drunk stumbling back from the bar district 2 blocks away. The calls started in my 7th week. The first one came at 2:17 a.m. from room 7 on 12. I answered with my standard greeting, but heard only static, thick and somehow wet-sounding, like interference recorded underwater. I hung up and called back to check if the guest needed anything. No answer, just that waterlogged static. The reservation system showed the room as vacant, deep cleaned that afternoon, and ready for tomorrow's check-in. I made a note for maintenance and forgot about it until the next night, when 712 called again. Same time, same static. Then 308 called at 2:43 a.m. with identical interference. Then 1407 at 3:11 a.m. I started tracking them on a notepad I kept hidden in my drawer. Within 2 weeks I had a pattern, 7 rooms in total, calling in a sequence that cycled every 3 nights. Some were occupied, some weren't. The timing never varied by more than a minute. When I mentioned it to engineering, the lead tech seemed unsurprised and said they'd been chasing this glitch since before his time. He suggested I just stop answering calls from those rooms, but I couldn't ignore them. Each night at 2:17, my phone console would light up with that first call, and I'd find myself reaching for it despite knowing what I'd hear. The static had begun to develop texture, patterns within the white noise that occasionally resolved into something that might have been breathing or might have been the building's ventilation system echoing through bad wiring. The security guard who worked the building's interior patrol mentioned the stairwells during one of his lobby check-ins. He was older than me, maybe 50, with the deliberate movements of someone conserving energy for a long shift. He'd asked if I ever needed to access the north stairwell for any reason. When I said no, he nodded and suggested I keep it that way. He didn't elaborate, but I noticed he always used the south stairwell for his rounds, even though the north one was closer to the elevators. Curiosity eventually overrode caution. On a quiet Tuesday, I propped the front desk with my cell phone and took a walk through the 3rd floor. The meeting rooms up there sat dark and empty, their doors propped open to show carpeted spaces filled with stacked chairs and folded tables. The air felt different, cooler, but not in a comfortable way. More like stepping into a walk-in cooler. That artificial cold that makes you aware of your own warmth. I stood in the largest meeting room and listened to the silence. It wasn't peaceful. The quality of quiet felt expectant, like the pause before someone speaks. I could hear my own heartbeat, my breathing, the rustle of my shirt fabric. But underneath that, or perhaps between those sounds, I detected something else. A presence, maybe. An attention, the feeling of being watched. I left quickly, and when I returned to the desk, I found 3 missed calls on my cell, all from internal extensions. 308, 712, 1407. All within the 2 minutes I'd been gone. Sleep became difficult. I'd return to my brother's basement as dawn broke, pull the blackout curtains, and lie in bed listening to the house settle around me. Every creak reminded me of the hotel's noises. Every shadow on the ceiling suggested movement. I'd doze off around 10 a.m. and wake at 6 p.m. with my heart already racing. Dreams I couldn't quite remember, leaving a residue of anxiety that followed me to work. The night audit position had begun to feel less like a job and more like a vigil. I started noticing details I'd overlooked before. The way the elevator sometimes paused at the 3rd floor, even when I'd pressed a different button. How the temperature would drop noticeably whenever I walked past certain doors. The scuff marks on the walls near the north stairwell that looked like small handprints, though that was probably just my imagination supplying meaning to random wear patterns. The other night guard, the one who worked weekends, quit without notice in my 9th week. Management scrambled to cover his shifts, and I found myself working 7 consecutive nights. By the 4th night, I'd stopped sleeping properly even during the day. By the 6th, I'd begun seeing things in my peripheral vision. Movement that disappeared when I turned to look directly. Shapes that might have been shadows, or might have been something more substantial. On the 7th night, exhausted and running on coffee and nerves, I encountered the skeptic. He was a security supervisor from corporate, brought in to assess whether the building needed additional coverage. I recognized the type immediately. Mid-40s, ex-military bearing. Someone who'd spent his career dealing with drunk guests and false alarms. He had the cynical confidence of a man who'd seen every scam and excuse. Ghosts were for tourists and superstitious cleaning staff. He told me this directly while reviewing the incident logs, pointing out that every reported strange occurrence could be explained by old building systems, guests playing pranks, or overactive imaginations. I almost envied his certainty. Management asked him to do a floor-by-floor assessment during the quiet hours, checking sightlines and blind spots. He started at the top and worked his way down, radio on his belt crackling with static similar to what I heard on the ghost calls. I tracked his progress through the building by his periodic check-ins, his voice growing fainter and more distorted as he climbed higher. The 15th floor housed the grand ballroom, rarely used now except for wedding receptions and corporate events. The supervisor reported it as clear at 3:47 a.m., his voice professional and bored. Then silence. I waited for his next check-in. The protocol required updates every 15 minutes. At 4:02, I called his radio. No response, just that underwater static. At 4:07, I tried again. This time I heard something underneath the interference. Rapid breathing, maybe, or something approximating it. At 4:15, the elevator dinged at the lobby level. He emerged, moving too quickly for a man who'd been so composed an hour earlier, his face colorless in the lobby's dim overnight lighting. He headed straight for the front entrance, and I had to call out twice before he acknowledged me. When he turned, his expression suggested he'd forgotten where he was or who I might be. I asked if everything was all right. He stared at me for several seconds before responding, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested great effort. He said he'd completed his assessment. The building was secure. There were no security concerns. But his hands shook as he signed the log, and he kept glancing at the elevator doors as if expecting them to open. When I asked what he'd seen on 15, he said nothing. Just old furniture and empty space. Then he corrected himself. Not empty exactly. He'd felt like someone else was up there with him. But when he turned on all the lights and searched thoroughly, he'd found no one. Just a feeling, he said. Just the building playing tricks. Old places do that. He left 20 minutes early, and I never saw him again. His report, which I found in my employee mailbox the next evening, recommended no additional security measures, but someone had paper-clipped a handwritten note to it, not in the supervisor's handwriting. It simply read, "Stay out of the ballroom." The calls intensified after that night. Not just the regular pattern of 7 rooms, but new extensions. The meeting rooms on 3 began calling in sequence, one after another, their static now containing distinct sounds, footsteps, maybe, or rhythmic tapping. The voicemail system, which should only activate when a call goes unanswered, Started leaving messages consisting of nothing but dead air and that persistent feeling that something was listening on the other end. I began keeping the lights brighter, all of them, even the decorative sconces that management usually kept dimmed for atmosphere. I moved the desk chair so my back faced the wall instead of the empty lobby. I started my rounds earlier and completed them faster, never lingering in any one space longer than necessary. The other staff had begun treating me differently. The housekeepers would make comments about how tired I looked. The morning desk clerk mentioned that I'd left strange notes in the logbook, warnings about checking certain rooms, reminders to verify that guests were actually present before delivering room service. I didn't remember writing them, but the handwriting was mine. My brother suggested I take a few days off. I told him I couldn't afford to, which was true but not the whole truth. The real reason was that I'd begun to fear what might happen if I left, as if my presence somehow maintained a balance, and my absence would allow something to shift, to change, to grow worse. This is the part where my memory becomes unreliable. I know I continued working. The paychecks in my bank account confirm I showed up and performed my duties, but the nights blur together now. A sequence of identical shifts, where the calls came at the same times, and the cold spots appeared in the same locations, and the feeling of being observed grew stronger with each passing hour. I remember walking through the third-floor meeting rooms at 4 a.m., searching for the source of footsteps I'd heard over the phone when 308 called, finding nothing but furniture and shadows and that persistent sense that I'd just missed seeing something, that if I'd turned my head a fraction of a second sooner, I would have understood everything. I remember standing at the base of the north stairwell, my hand on the door handle, feeling the cold radiating through the metal, hearing something on the other side that might have been wind through the HVAC system, or might have been someone climbing down from a higher floor, not opening the door. I remember the elevator stopping at 3 even though I'd pressed 1, the doors opening to show the darkened meeting room corridor. Standing in the elevator car for several minutes, unable to press the door close button, waiting for something to enter. Nothing did, but I felt its consideration, its awareness of me. And I remember the phone calls becoming more frequent, more insistent, until I stopped answering them altogether and let them ring through to voicemail, filling the system with hours of static and breathing and something underneath that sounded increasingly like words in a language I should have understood but couldn't quite parse. Last week, or maybe it was last month, time has gotten strange. Engineering brought in a specialist to examine the phone system. They traced the wiring through the walls, tested the circuit boards, replaced components, found nothing wrong with the equipment. The specialist mentioned that old hotels often develop electrical peculiarities, feedback loops in the system that generate apparent calls from empty rooms, perfectly normal for a building this age. But when he tested room 712's line, his equipment registered activity, even though the phone was unplugged from the wall. A dial tone originating from nowhere, sustained and clear. He packed his equipment quickly after that, and submitted a report I never saw. Yesterday morning, as my shift ended and dawn light began filtering through the lobby windows, the day clerk arrived early. She moved through her opening routine with practiced efficiency, and I briefed her on the night's events. 3 late check-ins, 1 noise complaint resolved, no incidents requiring management notification. She asked if the phones had been quiet. I told her yes, completely quiet. I'd stopped hearing them ring several days ago, though the console lights still indicated incoming calls at the usual times. She looked at me with something like pity and said I should take my vacation days. Management had approved 2 weeks, starting immediately. I needed rest. Everyone could see how the night shift was affecting me. I gathered my belongings, the notebook I'd filled with call logs and timing patterns, the map I'd drawn showing cold spots throughout the building, the recordings I'd made on my phone of the static-filled voicemails. Evidence of something, though I could no longer articulate what exactly I was trying to prove. As I crossed the lobby toward the exit, I glanced back at the elevator bank. The indicator lights showed both cars stopped at 3, though I'd watched them return to the lobby level minutes earlier. The day clerk stood at the desk, already focused on her computer screen, unaware or unconcerned. I should have left then. walked out into the morning and let the daylight burn away the residue of too many midnight hours. Instead, I turned and walked to the north stairwell. The door handle felt ice cold under my palm, colder than metal should ever feel in a heated building. I opened it. The stairwell was empty, of course, just concrete steps ascending and descending, fluorescent lights humming at the usual frequency. But the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air had that same expectant quality I'd felt in the third-floor meeting rooms, that sense of something waiting. I climbed to 3 and pushed open the door to the corridor. The meeting rooms sat dark and silent, exactly as they always appeared during my rounds. I walked to the largest one and stood in the doorway listening. The silence was absolute. Perfect. Too perfect. And then I heard it, not with my ears, but with some part of me that had been changed by months of night audit shifts and unanswered calls and the slow erosion of certainty that comes from working too long in a place where the walls hold too much history. Breathing. Footsteps. Whispers in that almost language I'd been hearing in the static. Not coming from any specific direction, but present in the air itself, as if the building had finally decided to speak directly. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had lost meaning somewhere during my descent into whatever this was, haunting or madness or some combination of both. When I finally turned to leave, I saw them. Not clearly, not directly, but in the corner of my vision, I registered presences. Shapes that suggested human forms but refused to solidify when I tried to focus. They watched me with an attention that felt ancient and patient, and utterly indifferent to my presence or absence. I walked back to the stairwell and descended to the lobby. Each floor I passed felt warmer, more real, until I emerged into the bright morning light where the day clerk filed paperwork and early guests lined up for checkout, and everything moved at the ordinary pace of regular business. She asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was fine, just tired. I accepted my vacation schedule and thanked her for covering my shifts. I haven't been back since. But here's what keeps me awake during the days. What makes me check my phone even though I've blocked the hotel's number. I don't know if I left because I chose to, or because something chose for me. I don't know if the presences I sensed were external entities, or projections of my deteriorating mental state. I don't know if the calls were real, or if I'd been answering silence for months, filling it with meaning that was never there. What I do know is that my replacement started 3 days ago. Young, eager, willing to work nights for the pay differential. Management mentioned during my exit interview that he's very reliable, always on time, very professional. Yesterday I received a text from an unknown number. Just coordinates, the hotel's address, and a timestamp. 2:17 a.m. I haven't decided yet if I'll go back, if I'll warn him about the calls and the cold spots, and the thing on the 15th floor that scared a man who didn't believe in ghosts. Part of me thinks I should let him discover it himself. Let him develop his own relationship with whatever lives in the walls between the floors. But another part, the part that still hears the static and quiet moments, that still feels the weight of observation when I'm alone, knows that it doesn't matter whether I warn him or not. The Grandview Hotel has stood for over a century, and it will stand for another century after that. It accumulates things during those years, memories, presences, the residue of all the lives that passed through its rooms and corridors. Maybe some buildings collect more than others. Maybe some buildings are hungry for that accumulation, drawing it in deliberately. Or maybe I just worked too many consecutive nights in an old building with faulty wiring and let my imagination transform ordinary sounds into something inexplicable. I'll never know for certain. But I do know this. If you ever find yourself taking a night audit position at an old downtown hotel, and someone mentions rooms that call themselves, or figures that appear in stairwells or floors where the temperature drops without reason, believe them. Not because ghosts are real or buildings are haunted. Believe them because whether it's real or imagined, once you start hearing those calls, once you start feeling that observation, once you let that boundary between the ordinary and the inexplicable blur enough, it won't matter what the truth is. You'll be changed by it regardless. And late at night, when you're trying to sleep and the silence feels too heavy, you'll wonder if that change came from the building or from inside yourself. You'll wonder. but you'll never be certain. That uncertainty is the worst haunting of all. Story 7. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar electric psalm at 1:47 a.m., that dead hour when the store became a cathedral of commerce abandoned by its congregation. I pushed the industrial mop across the linoleum, watching dirty water swirl into patterns that almost looked intentional, almost looked like they were trying to tell me something. The cleaning solution burned my nostrils, that sharp chemical smell that never quite masked the underlying scent of the store itself, that peculiar mixture of cardboard, plastic, and the thousands of people who shuffled through during daylight hours. Third shift at a 24-hour supercenter strips away any romantic notions about solitude. You're never truly alone. There's always the skeleton crew. The overnight manager holed up in her office, the stalker with headphones who moved through the aisles like a ghost, the security guard who made his rounds with the enthusiasm of a man counting down to retirement. And then there were the customers, those strange pilgrims of the small hours who wandered in seeking batteries, baby formula, or perhaps just some relief from whatever kept them from their beds. He appeared sometime between the frozen food section and the pharmacy, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when. One moment I was alone in aisle 7, and the next he was there, watching me work with an intensity that made my shoulders tense. He looked to be in his 60s, maybe older, one of those men whose age had been accelerated by hard living, with skin that seemed too loose on his frame, and eyes that held a peculiar brightness, almost feverish. The distance between us felt wrong from the start, like he'd skipped over the normal buffer zone people maintain with strangers. He stood close enough that I could smell him, stale cigarettes and something medicinal, something that reminded me of the nursing home where my grandmother spent her final years. When I moved my mop bucket to create more space, he drifted with me, maintaining that uncomfortable proximity as if we were magnetically connected. His voice, when it came, had the quality of rust scraping against metal. He began talking about his childhood in a town I'd never heard of, something with creek in the name, spinning out details about a paper mill and a river that ran the color of coffee. The words spilled from him in a torrent, barely paused for breath, each sentence tumbling over the last like he was afraid of silence, afraid of what might fill the gap if he stopped speaking. I nodded, offered non-committal sounds of acknowledgement, tried to communicate through body language that I needed to keep working, to finish my section. The mop became my anchor, my excuse, my shield. But he seemed oblivious to these social cues, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His narrative lurched from childhood to young adulthood, touching on a marriage that ended badly, though the details kept shifting. First she left him, then he left her, then she'd never existed at all, and he'd always been alone. The store's overhead speakers played their loop selection of soft rock and filtered pop, but beneath it I could hear other sounds. The refrigeration units cycling on and off, the distant beep of a register somewhere far away, the almost subsonic hum of the building itself. And underneath all of that, his voice, constant and increasingly unsettling as the contradictions mounted. He told me about working construction in 3 different states, or maybe it was 4, the number changed. He told me about a daughter who visited him twice a week, then later mentioned he'd never had children, then circled back to describe her wedding in vivid detail. His hands moved as he talked, reaching out to touch my shoulder, my arm. Gestures that started as emphatic punctuation but lingered too long, pressed too firmly, crossed boundaries I couldn't articulate but felt violated nonetheless. The fluorescent light seemed to flicker, just slightly, just enough to make me uncertain whether I'd really seen it, or if my eyes were simply tired from 6 hours of overnight work. When I glanced up at the fixtures, they burned steady and merciless, but in my peripheral vision they seemed to pulse, to breathe. That's when his story took a darker turn. He mentioned arrests, first one, then several. The charges never quite clear. Something about misunderstandings and bad lawyers and a judge who had it out for him specifically. He described courthouse hallways with the same rambling detail he'd given to everything else. But now there was an edge to his voice, a vibration that made the hair on my neck stand up. He'd served time, he said, though where and for how long kept changing. Sometimes it was 6 months in county, sometimes years in a state facility, and once, just once, he mentioned a place that sounded federal. Though he pivoted away from that so quickly, I wondered if I'd misheard. The store felt larger in his presence, the aisles stretching longer than they should, the ceiling higher, the walls farther away. Sound behaved strangely. His voice came too loud even when he seemed to be whispering, while my own responses felt muffled, absorbed by the air between us like the store itself was swallowing them. He told me about getting sick, about cancer that had spread from somewhere to somewhere else, though the location and severity shifted with each retelling. He'd beaten it, he said, or maybe he was still fighting it, or perhaps the doctors had given him months to live. His hand found my shoulder again, fingers digging in with surprising strength for someone who claimed to be dying, and stayed there while he described chemotherapy sessions that may or may not have happened at a hospital that may or may not exist. I tried to excuse myself, said something about needing to check in with my manager, about other sections that needed cleaning. The words felt thin and unconvincing even as I spoke them. He smiled, the first smile I'd seen from him. And it was wrong. Too many teeth or not enough. I couldn't tell which. Something about the geometry of it that didn't match his face. The mop bucket wheels squeaked as I pushed away, but he followed, maintaining that too close distance, still talking. The words now about his time inside, about men he'd known, about things that happened in places without witnesses. His stories had lost even the pretense of coherence now, jumping from courtrooms to prison cells to hospital beds and back again, sometimes occupying all 3 spaces in a single sentence. I became aware that we'd traversed the entire length of the store, that I'd been backing away, and he'd been advancing. And now we stood in the loading area near the rear entrance, far from the cameras, far from the overnight manager's office, far from anyone who might look up from their work and see us. The exit sign above the door glowed red, but the door itself seemed impossibly distant, like it was receding even as I stared at it. His voice dropped lower, became almost conspiratorial. He told me things about the inside that I didn't want to know, details about currency and power that were too specific to be inventions. He told me about men who'd done things, terrible things, things he'd heard about or witnessed, and here his eyes found mine with laser focus, things he'd done himself. The ambiguity was deliberate, I realized, the way he never quite committed to any version of events, keeping all possibilities suspended simultaneously. My pulse hammered in my ears. The rational part of my mind cataloged the situation. An unstable person, possibly under the influence of something, possibly experiencing some kind of break with reality. And me, alone with him in the most isolated part of the building. I should call for help, should trigger the silent alarm at the nearest register, should do anything, except stand here letting him trap me against the wall with his words and his proximity and his hands that kept reaching out, touching, claiming. But another part of my mind, a deeper and more primitive part, registered something else entirely. The way the shadows seemed to gather around him, darker than the dim loading area lighting justified. The way his outline occasionally seemed to blur at the edges, becoming indistinct before snapping back into sharp focus. The way time felt elastic in his presence, stretched and compressed simultaneously, so that I couldn't be certain if we'd been talking for 10 minutes or an hour. He mentioned cancer again, but now he described the pain in present tense, his hand pressing against his side. But when he lifted his shirt slightly, I didn't want to see. I looked away, but not before I glimpsed. There was nothing there. Smooth skin, no scars, no evidence of the surgeries he'd described in such detail. And yet the pain he conveyed seemed genuine, his face contorting, his breathing becoming labored. The overhead speakers had gone silent. I hadn't noticed when the music stopped, but the absence of it created a vacuum that his voice rushed to fill. He talked about getting out, about how nobody knew where he was now, about fresh starts and second chances and things left unfinished. His eyes never left mine, and I realized with a shock that I couldn't remember what color they'd been when I first saw him. Had they been this pale, This washed out, almost translucent. A crash from somewhere in the store, something falling, a display knocked over, made us both turn. When I looked back, he'd moved closer still, near enough now that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Except it wasn't heat, it was cold, a bone-deep chill that seemed to emanate from his core. He told me one more thing, leaning in close enough that his breath touched my ear, and what he said made no sense. A string of words about before and after and the spaces in between. About how some debts follow you, how some doors can't be closed, how the line between inside and outside was thinner than people thought. Then he was walking away, not toward the main store but toward the loading dock door, the one that required a badge to open, that should have been locked from the outside. He pushed through it without pausing, without breaking stride, and the alarm that should have screamed stayed silent. I stood frozen, watching the door close behind him with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the dead air of the loading area. My hands were shaking. I gripped the mop handle hard enough to hurt, using the pain to anchor myself to something concrete, something real. The store's ambient sounds came flooding back, the music resuming mid-song as if it had never stopped, the hum of electricity, the distant clatter of the stalker's cart. I grabbed my radio, my fingers fumbling with the buttons, ready to report an incident, an intrusion, something. But what would I say? A man told me his life story and then left? That I felt uncomfortable? That the shadows moved wrong and time felt broken? That his eyes changed color and his skin showed no scars, and he opened a locked door without touching the handle? I walked back through the store on unsteady legs, checking each aisle, looking for any evidence that he'd been there, that our conversation had happened. The floor was still wet from my mopping, the chemical smell still strong, but there were no other signs. No footprints but my own in the remaining dampness. No one else had seen him. I checked with the overnight manager, asked the stalker if anyone had come through his section, even reviewed the moment with the security guard during his next pass. Nobody had seen anything. The cameras showed me mopping alone, pausing occasionally, standing still sometimes as if listening to something. But no one else appeared in the frame. The timestamp showed the whole encounter had lasted 12 minutes, though it had felt like hours. When my shift ended at 6 a.m. and the morning crew started arriving, I walked out into the parking lot under a sky just beginning to lighten at the edges. My car sat where I'd left it, surrounded by the usual scattering of overnight vehicles. I unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a long moment before turning the key. On the passenger seat was something I didn't remember leaving there. A small item, insignificant really, a visitor's pass from a correctional facility upstate, the kind you get at check-in, printed with a date from 2 years ago and a name I didn't recognize. The plastic was yellowed with age. The text faded almost to illegibility. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. The photo on it showed a man who might have been him, or might have been someone else entirely. The image was too degraded to tell for certain, the features blurred and ambiguous. I should have thrown it away. I should have left it in the parking lot, or dropped it in the trash bin by the store entrance. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket, feeling its weight there like an anchor, like a question, like a door I could open if I chose to, though to what and to where I couldn't begin to guess. The drive home took longer than usual, though I followed my normal route. The streets seemed unfamiliar in the early morning light, or perhaps I was just tired, or perhaps something had shifted in some fundamental way that I couldn't quite identify. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the parking space with the engine running, unable to shake the feeling that I'd left something back at the store, something important, or perhaps what I'd left was something of myself, and what I'd brought home was something else entirely, something that smelled like cigarettes and medicine, something that talked in circles and contradictions, something that touched when it shouldn't and knew things it couldn't, something that opened locked doors and cast shadows that moved wrong and left no footprints, but might leave other traces, deeper marks, the kind that don't show up on security footage but burrow into your thoughts and wait there, patient, until the next time the lights flicker and the music stops and you realize you're not as alone as you thought you were. I turned off the engine. The silence rushed in. Somewhere in the distance, A door opened and closed. Footsteps on pavement, moving closer, then fading away. Or perhaps moving closer still, too close, just out of sight but definitely there, definitely real, or real enough. Which might be all that matters in the end. The visitor's pass felt heavy in my pocket as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, locked it behind me. The deadbolt clicked home with a sound like finality, like security, like protection. But I'd learned something during my shift. Something that the man with the changing story had taught me without ever saying it directly. Some doors lock from the inside, and some from the outside, and some don't lock at all, no matter how many times you turn the key. The trick is knowing which kind you're standing behind, and whether the person who told you their story was trying to get in, or trying to get out, or perhaps was never there at all except in the space between those possibilities, in the hours between midnight and dawn, in that territory where the fluorescent lights hum their electric psalm and nothing is quite as solid as it seems. I didn't work my next scheduled shift, or the one after that. Eventually I stopped going back at all. They called, left messages, sent the final paycheck in the mail. I never picked it up. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the visitor's pass and study it, trying to make out the blurred features in the photo, trying to remember exactly what he looked like, what he said, whether any of it was real. The details slip away like water, leaving only impressions, feelings, the memory of cold radiating from warm flesh, of time moving wrong, of shadows that gathered thick and patient. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I feel it, that pressure on my shoulder, those fingers digging in, not quite pain, but close to it, close enough. A touch that lingers, that claims, that reminds me of the conversation we had or didn't have, of the things he told me or didn't tell me, of the door he walked through that might not have been there at all. I tell myself it was exhaustion, stress, the mind playing tricks during that vulnerable hour when night tips toward morning. I tell myself the visitor's pass could have belonged to anyone, could have been in my car for months without me noticing. I tell myself that memory is unreliable, that perception is fallible, that the rational explanation is always the correct one. But late at night, in that space between waking and sleeping, I wonder if he's still there, walking the aisles, looking for someone else to listen, someone else to touch, someone else to tell his shifting story to. And I wonder if the person he finds will see him on the security cameras, or if they'll stand alone in the footage, pausing occasionally, listening to nothing, while the fluorescent lights hum overhead and something without footprints draws close in the sterile air, too close, close enough to whisper secrets that might be true, that might be false, that might be something worse than either, something that exists in the space between, in the ambiguity, in the uncertainty that follows you home and waits there, patient, indefinitely patient, for the moment when you're tired enough or lonely enough or vulnerable enough to let it in, or to realize it's been inside all along. Story 8. The house settled into its evening rhythm with a series of creaks that I'd learned to ignore over the past 3 months. Old bones adjusting to the cold, my sisters called it when they first moved in with me after the estate finally cleared probate. The radiators hissed and clanked, the floorboards groaned under their own weight, and somewhere in the walls, pipes sang their metallic songs. I'd grown accustomed to the symphony of an aging structure, the way you grow accustomed to tinnitus or the hum of fluorescent lights. These were sounds you could catalog, file away, forget. The laugh was not one of those sounds. I heard it first as a distant trill, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of the house. I was in the kitchen, hands submerged in dishwater that had gone lukewarm, staring at the geometric pattern of tiles behind the sink. My mind had wandered to mundane calculations about mortgage payments and property taxes when the sound registered, high-pitched, childlike, a giggle that seemed to echo from somewhere above me. My hands stilled in the water. Iris and Celeste weren't home yet. Their Tuesday ballet class ran until 8:30, and the kitchen clock read 8:15. The television in the living room was off. I'd checked it twice already, compulsively, the way I'd been checking locks and windows lately. The kind of checking that felt necessary but also excessive, the boundary between caution and paranoia growing thinner each day. I pulled my hands from the sink and dried them slowly, listening. The house offered only its usual groans and whispers. Yet something felt displaced, as if the air itself had shifted position. I walked to the base of the stairs and looked up into the shadowed hallway above. Nothing moved. The doors along the corridor stood as I'd left them, some closed, others ajar at precise angles I'd memorized without meaning to. The front door opened with its characteristic squeal, another sound I'd cataloged, and my sisters spilled inside with a gust of October wind. They brought the smell of cold air and dance studio with them, that particular combination of wooden floors and rosin and bodies in motion. Iris dropped her bag by the door with her typical carelessness. Celeste, more methodical, hung her coat on the designated hook. They were mid-conversation, something about their instructor's critique of pirouettes, when both stopped simultaneously. The transition from animated chatter to absolute silence was so abrupt, it seemed choreographed. They stood frozen in the entryway, heads tilted in identical angles of attention. Then I heard it again, clearer this time, unmistakable. A little girl's laugh, bright and tinkling like wind chimes, emanating from the upstairs hallway. Not from any particular room, but from the space itself. As if the corridor had developed vocal cords, Celeste's hand found the edge of the side table. Her knuckles went white against the dark wood. Iris took a step backward, her shoulder blades meeting the door she'd just closed. Neither spoke. We all listened to the silence that followed, the kind of silence that feels watchful, pregnant with held breath. I found myself moving toward them rather than toward the stairs. Some instinct suggested that we should stay together, clustered in the artificial warmth of the downstairs, where electric lights pushed back shadows and the space felt defensible. The laugh had originated from above, and everything in me resisted the idea of ascending toward it. Iris spoke first, her voice stripped of its usual vibrancy. She asked if I'd heard it too, though the question felt rhetorical. We'd all heard it. The real question, unspoken, was what had made that sound. She suggested perhaps a television left on, though without conviction. I told them all the TVs were off, all the devices powered down. I'd checked them. I checked everything lately. Celeste moved to the window, pulled the curtain aside with one finger. The street outside lay empty under the amber glow of streetlights. No children playing, no open windows in neighboring houses. The sound had come from inside our home, from our upstairs hallway, where nobody should be, where nobody could be. The three of us stood in a loose triangle, exchanging glances that communicated more than words could. We were adults, educated, rational people who understood acoustics and settling houses, and the tricks that wind could play through old ductwork. Yet something in that laugh had bypassed our rational minds entirely, and spoken directly to more primitive parts of our brains. The parts that still remembered when humans weren't apex predators, when darkness held real threats. I made myself walk to the stairs. My hand found the banister, and I noted the way my palm left a slight sheen of sweat on the polished wood. The first step creaked under my weight, another cataloged sound. I climbed slowly, each footfall deliberate, while my sisters remained below, watching my ascent with an attention that felt protective and useless in equal measure. The upstairs hallway stretched before me, longer than it should have been, though I knew this was a trick of perspective and fear. 4 doors branched off the corridor. My bedroom at the far end, the bathroom to the left. 2 spare rooms, one that Iris had claimed, one that Celeste used for her art supplies but hadn't yet moved into. All the doors stood in their familiar configurations. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I checked each room methodically, turning on lights, looking behind doors, pulling aside shower curtains. The spaces revealed nothing unusual. Beds made, surfaces clear, windows closed and locked, yet each room felt subtly wrong, as if someone had been there moments before and had rearranged molecules in ways too subtle to detect, but profound enough to register in the gut. In Celeste's art room, I paused. The paintings she'd been working on, Abstract pieces in deep blues and grays seemed darker than I remembered. Or perhaps the lighting had shifted. Or perhaps my perception had shifted. I found myself studying the canvases, looking for hidden shapes, messages encoded in brushstrokes, finding nothing, finding too much. When I returned downstairs, Iris had made tea. The kettle's whistle had marked a return to normalcy, a sound that belonged to the inventory of acceptable noises. We sat in the living room with our cups, steam rising in pale wisps, none of us drinking. Celeste suggested rational explanations. Sound could travel strangely in old houses, perhaps from a neighbor's home, somehow amplified through walls or pipes, perhaps an electronic device we'd forgotten about, some toy left behind by previous owners. But we'd searched. I'd searched. The house held no forgotten toys, no devices that could produce that sound. And something about the quality of the laugh felt too immediate, too present, to have originated anywhere but exactly where we'd heard it. In our hallway, in our home. The rest of the evening passed in a state of heightened awareness. We left more lights on than usual. We stayed together in the living room, abandoning our typical routines of separate spaces and individual activities. The television played at low volume, creating a buffer of human voices, though none of us paid attention to what was on screen. We were listening instead to the house, monitoring its acoustic patterns, waiting for something that didn't come. Iris eventually went upstairs first, declaring her exhaustion and her refusal to let a strange sound dictate her schedule. She'd always been the braver one, or perhaps the more stubborn. Celeste and I remained below until we heard Iris's bedroom door close, heard the sounds of her evening routine filter down through the ceiling. Normal sounds, catalogable sounds, sounds that suggested everything was fine. But when Celeste stood to follow her sister upstairs, she hesitated at the base of the steps. She asked if I would check the hallway one more time, and there was no embarrassment in her request, no attempt to couch it in rationality. She simply wanted someone to look, to confirm that the space remained empty, remained normal, remained ours. I walked up those stairs for the second time that night, and the hallway felt different in a way I couldn't articulate. The air seemed thicker, more resistant. The shadows in the corners appeared darker, more substantial, as if they'd accumulated mass. I walked the length of the corridor, my footsteps sounding too loud in the silence, and felt with absolute certainty that I was being watched. Not by my sisters below, not by anything I could see or name, but watched nonetheless. That night, lying in my bed, I didn't sleep. I listened instead. To my sisters breathing in their rooms, to the house settling, to the wind outside, and to something else, something I couldn't quite hear but felt certain was there, a presence, an attention, a waiting. The laugh came again at 3:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone when it happened, the blue light harsh against the darkness, my thumb scrolling through nothing, just needing something to do with my hands. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade, that same bright, childlike giggle coming from somewhere close. Too close. This time it was followed by footsteps, small footsteps, quick and light, pattering down the hallway outside my door, the rhythm wrong somehow, too fast or too slow or with too many beats. I sat up in bed, my heart performing gymnastics in my chest, and stared at the door. The footsteps passed. The laugh faded. Silence rushed back in, oppressive and complete. I didn't leave my room. I told myself this was rational. What would I find? What could I do? But the truth was simpler and more primal. I was afraid, not of what I might see, but of what I might not see. Of standing in an empty hallway while those sounds continued around me. Proof that something existed in a space I couldn't access, in a reality adjacent to my own, but forever separated. Morning came with the brutal mercy of daylight. The house resumed its daytime personality, all creaking charm and filtered sunshine. Iris and Celeste looked as exhausted as I felt, their eyes carrying the weight of interrupted sleep. Over coffee, we compared notes with the careful precision of scientists documenting an experiment. Celeste had heard the laugh at 3:17. Iris had heard footsteps at 3:20. None of us had left our rooms. None of us had found anything. We discussed leaving. The word hung in the air between us, tempting and impossible. This house was ours. We'd fought for it, waited for it, planned our futures around it. To abandon it after less than a season felt like surrender to something we couldn't even name. And where would we go? What explanation would we give? That we'd heard laughter and footsteps in an empty hallway? That we felt watched? That the house had changed in ways we couldn't articulate but knew with cellular certainty? Instead, we established new routines. We stayed together more. We left lights on constantly, driving up the electric bill to astronomical heights. We created noise, television always playing, music streaming through speakers, our own conversations filling the spaces between. We were trying to crowd out the silence, to leave no room for other sounds to emerge. But it didn't work. The laugh came again and again, sometimes at night, sometimes during the day, always from the hallway. Always the same bright, childlike giggle that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. We never saw anything. We searched constantly and found nothing. No source, no explanation. Just the sound and the certainty that something was there, something that existed in the corners of our perception, always just out of reach. I began documenting everything. Times, durations, exact locations where the sound seemed to originate. I mapped the house, measured walls, looked for hidden spaces where something could hide. I found nothing because there was nothing to find. The house was solid, its walls and floors and ceilings exactly where they should be. Yet the sounds persisted, unchanging, impossible, real. Celeste started painting again, but her work had shifted. The abstract pieces gave way to more representational images, though I couldn't tell what they represented. Shadows, perhaps. Spaces between things, negative space given form and substance. She worked in a frenzy, canvas after canvas, and refused to discuss what she was creating. When I looked at the paintings, they made me feel the way the hallway felt at night. Watched, displaced, wrong. Iris stopped sleeping upstairs entirely. She made a nest on the living room couch, surrounding herself with blankets and pillows, claiming the light from the street made it easier to rest. But I saw the way she positioned herself to keep the stairs in view, the way her eyes tracked every sound, the way she'd stopped pretending this was all explainable, all normal, all fine. As for me, I started questioning everything, not just the sounds in the house, but my own perception. Had I always been this paranoid, this obsessive? I found myself cataloging not just the house's sounds, but my own thoughts, monitoring them for signs of deterioration, for evidence that my mind was playing tricks, that the real problem wasn't the house, but me, us, our collective delusion, feeding off each other, growing stronger through shared belief. But then I'd hear it again, that laugh, clear and bright and undeniable, and I'd know, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely, that something was wrong. Something was in our house, or something was wrong with our house, or something was wrong with reality itself in this particular location, in this specific configuration of space and time. Tonight, as I write this, it's quiet. Too quiet. The absence of sound feels more threatening than the presence of it. I'm sitting in the kitchen, the same spot where I first heard the laugh, and I'm watching the ceiling, watching for shadows that move wrong, watching for signs of something I can't name but know is there. My sisters are upstairs. They insisted on sleeping in their rooms tonight, claiming they refuse to be driven from their own beds. Or perhaps they're too exhausted to care anymore. Perhaps we've all reached some threshold where fear becomes familiar, where the impossible becomes routine, where you accept that you live in a house that laughs at you with a voice that shouldn't exist. I hear footsteps now, quick and light, pattering down the hallway above me, the rhythm wrong, always wrong. And I sit here, frozen, unable to go up, unable to ignore it, unable to do anything but listen and wait and wonder if I'm losing my mind, or if there are things in this world that exist in the spaces between what we can see and what we know is there. The laugh comes again, bright, childlike, impossible. And I realize with a clarity that feels like drowning, that it doesn't matter anymore whether this is real or madness. The effect is the same. We are haunted by something, by nothing, by the sound itself, which has taken up residence in our home and in our heads, and which will never, ever leave. The kitchen light flickers. Once, twice. The laugh continues, echoing from everywhere and nowhere, and I close my eyes and listen and accept that some questions don't have answers, some fears don't have names, and some houses hold more than walls and floors and the people who live inside them. They hold sounds that shouldn't exist, presences we can't see, laughter that echoes from empty hallways, from the spaces between our certainty and our doubt, from whatever lies beyond the thin membrane of reality we pretend is solid. And we live here now, with it, beside it, inside it, unable to leave, unable to explain, unable to do anything but wait for the next time we hear it. The upstairs laugh, our constant companion, our impossible truth. The light flickers again, and in the moment of darkness before it returns, I hear something new, a whisper. So quiet I might have imagined it, but I didn't. I know I didn't. It said my name. Story 9. The fluorescent lights in the West Wing hummed their usual dirge as I made my rounds that Thursday night. 3 months into working the graveyard shift at Meadowbrook Elder Care, and I'd learned to move through those corridors with the mechanical precision of someone who'd trained himself not to think too deeply about the sounds old buildings make after midnight. The rhythmic squeak of my sneakers against linoleum, the wet rasp of breathing behind closed doors, the occasional cry that might have been a dream, or might have been something else entirely. But that was before Mr. Brannigan died. I'd never liked him. None of us had. The old man possessed the particular cruelty that some people cultivate in their final years. As if sensing their remaining time, they decided to concentrate a lifetime's worth of bitterness into whatever moments they had left. He'd pinch the aides who leaned over to adjust his pillows, hard enough to leave marks that bloomed purple against their skin. He'd throw his medication cups at anyone who entered his room, cackling when the pills scattered across the floor and someone had to crouch down to retrieve them. The other residents gave his door a wide berth, and I'd catch them whispering sometimes, falling silent when staff walked by. The morning shift found him on Tuesday. Natural causes, the doctor said. 92 years old, bad heart, no family to notify. By Wednesday afternoon, his room had been cleared and sanitized, ready for the next occupant. That's how it worked in places like Meadowbrook. People arrived, people left, and the rooms just kept cycling through, holding each temporary life like a lung holds breath. I should have known something had shifted when I arrived for my Thursday shift and found the day nurse still lingering by the front desk. Her coat already on, but her feet planted as if roots had grown through the soles of her shoes into the foundation. She had the look of someone trying to convince themselves that staying longer wouldn't change anything. She told me about the knocking. It had started around 2 in the afternoon, she said. Steady raps against walls, moving down the corridors. At first, she'd thought it was maintenance. Maybe someone checking the radiators, even though it was only early October and we wouldn't need heat for another few weeks. But there was no maintenance scheduled, no workers present, just that persistent knock, knock, knock that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the acoustic tiles until you couldn't pin down a source. I dismissed it. Old buildings settle, pipes knock. Wind finds its way into unexpected places and creates percussion against loose fittings. I'd learned these explanations during my first week, repeated them like prayers whenever the night grew too quiet, and my mind began populating the silence with its own dark offerings. The first hour of my shift passed without incident. I distributed evening medications, helped Mrs. Vanderholm to the bathroom, adjusted Mr. Chen's television volume when he complained he couldn't hear his program over some unspecified noise. Normal tasks, normal night. The kind of shift where you could almost convince yourself that nothing in the world existed beyond these walls, these rooms, this perpetual cycle of care and deterioration. Then I heard it. The sound came from the West Wing, down near where Mr. Brannigan's room sat empty and dark. Not a knock exactly, more like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the measured pace of someone who knew these halls intimately. I stood at the nurse's station, pen hovering over my documentation, and listened. The footsteps moved closer, seemed to pause right at the corner where the corridor turned, then retreated, growing fainter, fading into that peculiar silence that follows unexplained sounds, where you hold your breath and wait for confirmation that you actually heard anything at all. I checked the time, 10:45. Made a note in the log about increased monitoring, though I didn't specify what I was monitoring for. At 11:30, the call lights began. Mrs. Vanderholm first, then Mr. Patterson, then 3 more in rapid succession, their rooms strung along the west wing like beads on a wire. I moved between them, faster than I should have, my heart rate climbing with each new illuminated button. They all said variations of the same thing. Someone had been in their room. A visitor. A small person, barely visible in the darkness, standing in the corner, watching. Mr. Patterson, whose mild dementia usually manifested as pleasant confusion about which decade he was living in, grabbed my wrist with surprising strength when I leaned over to check his vitals. His eyes had gone wide and very clear, lucid in a way I hadn't seen before. "There was a little man in here," he said, wearing old clothes, just standing there. I'd offered the usual reassurances. Dreams feel real sometimes. The medication can cause vivid imagery. Shadows play tricks in the darkness. But my voice sounded thin even to my own ears, and when I left his room, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the empty corridor behind me. The lights started flickering at 1:15, not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too much like a scene from the movies people watch when they want manufactured fear in controlled doses. These were subtle stutters, brief interruptions in the current that made you question whether you'd actually seen them happen. A light would dim for half a second, so quickly you might have just blinked. Another would brighten slightly, creating a small pool of brilliance that faded back to normal before you could be certain the change had occurred. I told myself it was the electrical system. Buildings this old developed quirks in their wiring, especially in October when the temperature fluctuations made materials expand and contract. Perfectly rational, perfectly explainable. The door to Mr. Brennigan's old room was open. I'd walked past it twice already that night, and I was certain as I could be about anything anymore, that it had been closed both times. The door now stood ajar maybe 6 inches, just enough for darkness to spill out into the hallway like something liquid and purposeful. I stood there for what might have been seconds or minutes, staring at that gap, waiting for movement that didn't come. Professional protocol dictated that I investigate, check for intruders, ensure the space remained secure. All the sensible things that made perfect sense when written in employee handbooks and made no sense at all when you were standing in a too quiet hallway at 1:30 in the morning, staring at a door that shouldn't be open. I pushed it wider. The room was empty. Of course it was empty. The bed had been stripped, the surfaces cleared, even the small personal items that accumulate in hospital rooms, boxes of tissues, plastic water pitchers, remote controls, had all been removed. The space possessed that particular quality of recently vacated places, where the absence of a previous occupant hangs in the air like a question no one wants to answer. But the smell, that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the clinical scent of disinfectant that usually dominated these rooms after a death. This was older, moustier, like something that had been shut away in a damp cellar for decades and had suddenly found its way into open air. I breathed through my mouth and backed out, pulling the door closed, making sure, this time, that it latched completely. The knocking started again at 2 o'clock. Louder now, more insistent. A pattern of 3 sharp raps that echoed down the corridors and seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I tried to triangulate the source, moving from one wing to another, pressing my ear against different sections of drywall. The sound remained maddeningly diffuse, present everywhere and localized nowhere. By 2:30, I'd received 7 more call lights, 7 more residents reporting the same impossible visitor. A little man, very short, dressed strangely, standing in the corner of their rooms, sometimes near the window, always watching, never speaking. Mrs. Chen, who'd been at Meadowbrook longer than any current staff member and possessed the sharp wit that had somehow survived her failing body, looked at me with something approaching pity when I tried to suggest she'd been dreaming. "You hear it too," she said. "The walking, the knocking. You're hearing it right now." And I was. Even as I stood in her room, making notes about her blood pressure and oxygen saturation, I could hear those footsteps moving somewhere close by. Slow and measured. Patient. I found the mark at 3:15. Mr. Patterson had called again, his voice thin and frightened over the intercom. When I entered his room, he was sitting up in bed, pointing at his forearm. In the dim light from his bedside lamp, I could see it clearly. A bruise, fresh and dark, in the unmistakable shape of a small footprint, complete with the outline of toes, as if something had walked across his arm while he slept. My hands shook as I documented it, took photos with the facility camera we kept for incidents, filled out the paperwork that would trigger an investigation into possible abuse. All the proper procedures, all the correct protocols, none of which explained how a footprint could appear on an old man's arm in a locked facility where everyone was accounted for. The administrative supervisor arrived at 4. I'd called her at 3:30, after the third check of Mr. Patterson's room revealed no rational explanation for the mark. She examined it herself, her face carefully neutral in that way administrators learn when they need to acknowledge something problematic without committing to any particular interpretation. We'd increased monitoring, she decided. Document everything. She'd contact the director in the morning. In the meantime, standard protocols applied, which meant I should continue my rounds as if the night hadn't already twisted itself into something I no longer recognized. She left before dawn, and I was alone again with the humming lights and the breathing darkness and the sounds that shouldn't exist. At 5 o'clock, the night gave up one last secret. I'd been in the medication room, counting pills and trying to focus on the simple mathematics of dosages and distribution. The kind of concrete task that kept your mind tethered to reality. Through the small window in the door, I saw it. A figure moving past in the corridor. Small, maybe 4 feet tall, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing, though the details were hard to make out in the uncertain light. It moved with a strange gait, slightly lurching, and as it passed the window, it turned its head toward me. I didn't see its face, or maybe I did see it and my mind has worked very hard in the hours since to ensure I can't recall the details. All I remember with certainty is the feeling that washed over me. Recognition, as if something that had been watching from a great distance had finally decided to let itself be seen. By the time I reached the door and yanked it open, the corridor was empty. The morning shift found me at the nurse's station, documentation spread in front of me, trying to write an incident report that captured the night's events without sounding like I'd suffered some kind of breakdown. The day nurse, different from yesterday's lingering presence, listened to my recap with an expression that cycled through skepticism, concern, and something that might have been fear. She told me about the spiritual counselor. The facility had called one in, she said. Not officially, not in any way that would appear in records, but someone from the director's office had arranged for a local priest to visit, to perform some kind of blessing in Mr. Brennigan's old room. He'd come yesterday evening, before I'd arrived for my shift. Spent 20 minutes alone in there with the door closed. When he emerged, he'd looked pale and shaken, but he'd assured them the matter was resolved. I drove home as the sun climbed higher, painting the October sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed impossibly bright after the night I'd endured. Sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, my dreams were full of footsteps and that smell of damp earth in dark corners. I returned for my shift that evening, expecting more of the same. More knocking, more footsteps, more reports of the little man who stood in corners and watched. But the building was quiet. The residents slept peacefully. The lights maintained their steady glow. The corridors echoed with nothing more than my own footsteps and the familiar sounds of an old building settling into its foundation. By midnight, I'd almost convinced myself that the previous night had been an anomaly. Stress, fatigue, the power of suggestion working on an exhausted mind, almost. Because sometimes when I pass Mr. Brannigan's old room, occupied now by a sweet woman who moved in this afternoon and who sleeps soundly behind a closed door, I catch that smell again. Just a whiff. Damp earth. Dark corners. Something that had been shut away and perhaps still isn't entirely gone. And late in my shift, when the building reaches its quietest point, I sometimes hear it. Very faint. Almost impossible to distinguish from the ambient noise of the facility. The sound of small footsteps, patient and measured, walking somewhere just beyond the edges of my perception. Mrs. Chen stopped me last night during my rounds. She'd been awake, sitting in her chair by the window, looking out at the dark grounds. "It's still here," she said. "You know that, don't you? It's just learned to be quieter." I didn't ask what she meant. Didn't need to. Because I know she's right. Whether the counselor's blessing worked or whether something simply decided to retreat further into the shadows, I can't say. I don't think I'll ever be able to say with certainty what happened during those 2 nights, or what it means that the disturbances stopped so abruptly. All I know is that I still work the graveyard shift at Meadowbrook Elder Care. I still make my rounds through humming corridors and past doors that hold their sleeping occupants. I still document vitals and distribute medications and respond to call lights. And sometimes, when I turn a corner or glance up from my paperwork, I catch movement in my peripheral vision. Small, quick, gone before I can focus on it directly. The little man, perhaps, or the shape my exhausted mind has learned to give to fear. I'm not sure which possibility frightens me more. What I do know, what keeps me awake during the hours I should be sleeping, is this. Mr. Brannigan was a cruel man, and in his cruelty, he'd made a particular enemy of one resident. An older gentleman, barely 4 feet tall due to severe spinal curvature. Someone who died here years before I arrived. Someone whose room, I learned from reviewing old records, had been the same room where Mr. Brannigan spent his final months. The same room where the counselor performed his blessing. The same room where, on my last shift, I noticed the door standing open again. Just 6 inches. Just enough for darkness to spill out into the hallway. I closed it, of course. Made sure it latched. But I wonder, in those hours before dawn when wondering is all that remains, whether closing doors matters much to things that have already learned how to exist in the spaces between. Whether blessing a room can truly remove something that was already part of the building's history. Whether the little man is gone or simply waiting. And whether someday I might be the one calling out in the darkness, trying to tell someone about the visitor in my corner. The one who's learned to be very, very quiet. Story 10. The fluorescent lights in the back office hummed with that particular frequency that gets under your skin after the 3rd hour. I'd been staring at the security monitors for most of my shift, watching empty hallways and static parking lots, when Davies from maintenance stopped by around 2 in the morning. He leaned against the door frame, coffee in hand, and started talking about the 4th floor. Every hotel has stories. The Riverside Inn had been standing since 1947, and Davies claimed he'd heard things up there. Footsteps in vacant rooms, doors that locked themselves, the usual nonsense that bored night staff tell each other to stay awake. I'd nodded along, only half listening, my attention divided between his rambling and the spreadsheet on my secondary monitor. The October wind rattled the windows, and Davies mentioned something about guests who checked in but never checked out, their presence lingering in the walls, in the pipes, in the very foundation of the building. After he left, the office felt different, smaller somehow. The air conditioning kicked on with a mechanical groan that seemed too loud, too deliberate. I told myself it was just the power of suggestion, the way ghost stories can recalibrate your perception of ordinary sounds. But my eyes kept drifting back to the monitors, scanning for movement that wasn't there. The laundry room camera showed nothing but industrial washers and fluorescent glare. The basement hallway stretched empty and gray. The loading dock sat in its pool of amber light, undisturbed. Everything exactly as it should be at 2:47 on a Thursday morning. I returned to the audit reports, reconciling room charges and logging maintenance requests. The work was methodical, almost meditative, until I glanced at monitor 3 and saw it. Something white. Not quite a shape, not quite formless. It hung in the corner of the laundry room frame, visible for perhaps 2 seconds before the camera's automatic rotation panned away. My heart performed that peculiar stutter it does when your brain hasn't quite processed what your eyes have registered. I clicked to manually control the camera, swinging it back to that corner. Nothing. Just the industrial shelving unit and stacks of folded linens, everything precisely where it should be. I rewound the footage, watching the timestamp crawl backward. When I played it forward at normal speed, there it was again. A white blur, almost luminescent in the harsh overhead lighting, present for exactly 7 frames before vanishing. The rational part of my mind cataloged explanations. A reflection, a processing glitch, something falling from a shelf. But Davy's voice echoed in my memory, and the office suddenly felt too exposed, too vulnerable with its windows facing the parking lot and its single entrance from the lobby. I should have called security. That's what the protocol manual said. Any suspicious activity, any anomaly, call the night guard first. But my hand was already reaching for the master key card, my feet already moving toward the door. Some instinct deeper than reason told me that whatever I'd seen required immediate investigation, that waiting even 5 minutes would mean missing something crucial. The basement stairs descended into cooler air that smelled of concrete and industrial detergent. The fluorescent tubes down here flickered at irregular intervals, creating brief pockets of darkness that my eyes struggled to adjust to. Each footfall echoed too loudly, announcing my presence to whatever might be waiting. The laundry room door stood ajar. I distinctly remembered seeing it closed on the monitor. The small wedge of darkness between door and frame seemed to pulse with its own breathing rhythm. I pressed my palm against the metal surface, feeling its chill seep through my skin, and pushed. The room beyond looked exactly as it had on camera. Washers lined one wall, dryers the other, with sorting tables in the middle and shelving units along the back. The overhead lights hummed their monotonous song. Nothing moved. But the air felt disturbed, as though something had recently passed through it, leaving invisible ripples in its wake. I stepped inside, and that's when I sensed the presence behind the door. Human instinct is older than reason. Some primitive part of my brain registered the wrongness before my conscious mind could process it. The quality of silence changed. The air pressure shifted. I spun around to find a man pressed flat against the wall in the narrow space between door and frame, his body contorted into impossible thinness. He was tall, abnormally so, with limbs that seemed too long for proper proportion. His clothes hung on him like grave wrappings, colorless and indistinct. But it was his face that stopped my breath. Gaunt to the point of skull-like, with eyes that reflected the fluorescent light like an animal's caught in headlights. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching me with an expression that might have been fear or hunger, or something for which language has no name. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than seconds. My mouth opened to shout, to challenge him, but no sound emerged. He remained motionless, and in that stillness, I noticed details that didn't fit. His clothes were too white, too clean for someone who'd broken into a hotel basement. No dirt, no sweat, no signs of human occupation at all. Then he moved. Not toward me or away, but sideways, his body seeming to compress and slide along the wall in a manner that defied normal joint movement. The motion was fluid, wrong, like watching someone move underwater or in a dream where physics operates by different rules. My paralysis broke. I stumbled backward, crashing into a sorting table. The sound shattered the awful silence, and he lunged. Not at me, but past me, through the doorway and into the basement corridor. I heard his footsteps receding, that peculiar slapping sound of bare feet on concrete, though I could have sworn he'd been wearing shoes. I pursued him on instinct, some deeply ingrained refusal to let an intruder escape. The corridor stretched ahead, longer than I remembered, with doors to various utility rooms branching off at regular intervals. He was fast, impossibly fast, and I caught only glimpses of that white figure as he turned corners and darted through doorways. The pursuit led me to the maintenance room at the far end of the basement, a space I'd only visited twice in 8 months of employment. The door hung open, and I could see the sprinkler system's main junction, pipes and valves covering one wall like mechanical intestines. The window above the workbench had been forced open, its frame bent outward, cold October air streaming through the gap. He was gone. The room stood empty except for the usual detritus of maintenance work: tool chests, spare parts, instruction manuals. Nothing disturbed except that window and a collection of tools missing from their shadow board outlines on the wall. A hammer, 2 screwdrivers, a pry bar. The logical conclusion presented itself immediately. An intruder had broken in to steal tools. I'd interrupted him. He'd fled. But logic couldn't explain why my hands were shaking, why the air in that room tasted wrong, metallic and bitter, why the temperature seemed to drop further the longer I stood there, my breath forming clouds that dissipated too slowly. I returned to the office and called security, then the police. Within an hour, the basement hummed with activity. Officers took my statement while the night guard examined the maintenance room. I recounted the events in a voice that sounded strange to my own ears, clinical and distant. The detective nodded, writing in her notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the suspect's appearance and behavior. They found evidence of forced entry, scratch marks on the window frame, footprints in the dust, the missing tools documented and photographed. Everything supported the straightforward narrative of a break-in interrupted. But no one commented on what I kept noticing. The footprints were wrong. Too long, too narrow, spaced too far apart for normal human gait. Davies appeared as the police were leaving, drawn by the commotion. He listened to my abbreviated version of events with an expression I couldn't read. When I finished, he asked if the intruder had said anything. I told him no. We'd barely exchanged a glance before he fled. Davies nodded slowly and mentioned that the laundry room had been part of the original building, built over the old furnace room where, in 1952, a maintenance worker had disappeared during his shift. They'd found his tools scattered across the floor, but never found him. I laughed. The sound came out sharp and brittle. Ghost stories. We'd been telling ghost stories, and then I'd seen an intruder. And now Davies was trying to retrofit the incident into his haunted hotel narrative. Pure coincidence, synchronicity. The human brain's tendency to find patterns in chaos. But after everyone left and I returned to my monitors, I couldn't stop rewinding that footage. 7 frames of white blur in the corner. I advanced it frame by frame, studying each pixel. The shape wasn't quite right. Too tall for the space it occupied, overlapping itself in ways that suggested either camera malfunction or something that didn't obey normal spatial rules. At 5:30, as dawn began to gray the windows, I went back to the maintenance room. The window had been secured, the tools marked as evidence. Everything tidy and explained. I stood in the exact spot where the intruder must have stood while forcing the window open and looked up at the sprinkler system junction. He would have needed a ladder. The window sat 8 feet off the ground, reachable only from a standing position on the workbench. But the workbench surface showed no marks, no disturbance in the thin layer of dust that filmed everything in the maintenance room. And the tool shadow board hung on the opposite wall, 15 feet away. He would have had to cross the room, select his tools, return to the bench, climb up, force the window, and climb back down, all without leaving a single footprint in the dust, except those leading to and from the door where I'd entered. I stood there as the heating system kicked on, warm air flowing through the vents with a sound like breathing. The shadow board gaps stared back at me like empty eye sockets. Somewhere above, the hotel was waking up, guests stirring in their rooms, the day staff arriving, normal life resuming. But I couldn't stop thinking about how thin he'd looked, how he'd compressed himself behind that door in a space that shouldn't have accommodated a human body, how his movement had seemed less like running and more like something trying to remember how humans move, approximating it from distant memory or observation. And I couldn't stop wondering what Davies had meant when he'd said they found the maintenance workers' tools scattered across the floor. Which tools, specifically? Whether they'd been a hammer, 2 screwdrivers, and a pry bar. Whether the shapes we sometimes see in security footage, present for 7 frames and then gone, are glitches in recording technology, or glimpses of something that's learned to exist in the spaces between digital capture rates. Whether the man I'd chased through the basement had been running away or simply returning home, annoyed at being disturbed in whatever business he'd been conducting in rooms that humans only visit occasionally, never staying long, never looking too closely at the corners where the cameras don't quite reach. I left the maintenance room without securing the door. Behind me, the heating system sighed through the pipes. Somewhere in the walls, something moved with a sound like footsteps or settling pipes, or the memory of motion captured in old wood and older stone. The day auditor arrived at 6. I gave him the condensed version of the night's events. Break-in, police report filed, everything handled. He made sympathetic noises and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, just tired, ready to go home and sleep. But I knew I wouldn't sleep. Not for a long time. Because I'd gone back and checked the laundry room camera footage from the exact moment I'd entered that room, when I'd spun around to find the figure behind the door. The camera angle should have captured him perfectly, pressed against that wall. The footage showed me entering, showed me spinning around, showed me staring at an empty wall for 7 full seconds before backing away from nothing at all. Story 11. The fluorescent lights in the security booth hummed their monotonous song, the same pitch they'd held for the past 4 hours of my shift. Outside, the parking lot stretched like a concrete ocean under the sodium lamps, each vehicle a dark island in pools of orange light. I'd been working nights at the Riverside Commerce Center for 3 months now, and the solitude had become something I almost craved. No demanding clients, no small talk, just me and the silence and the occasional sweep of headlights as someone worked late. The first call came at 2:47 a.m. The phone's ring shattered the quiet so completely that I knocked over my coffee, watching the dark liquid spread across the incident log I'd been pretending to fill out. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the receiver, though I told myself it was just the startled jolt of the unexpected sound. The voice on the other end was male, measured, almost too calm. He told me that a car in the east lot had its lights on, a silver sedan, and that someone should probably check it before the battery died. He didn't give his name when I asked, just repeated the information about the lights, the location, and then the line went dead with a soft click that seemed to echo in my ear long after. I stared at the phone for a moment, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. The east lot was visible from my booth if I pressed my face against the glass and looked hard to the right. I did that now, breath fogging the window, eyes straining against the distance and the dark. I could make out the shapes of vehicles, maybe 30 or 40 of them scattered across the grid of parking spaces, but I couldn't see any lights. Everything looked dead and still. The logical part of my brain said to log it and do a sweep. That was protocol. But something else, some primal instinct that lives in the base of the skull, whispered that I should stay exactly where I was, in this lit box with its locked door and its direct line to the police station. I compromised. I noted the call in the log, recorded the time, and decided I'd check the security cameras first. The monitor to my left cycled through 12 different views of the property, each angle showing the same essential emptiness. When the east lot camera came up, I leaned in close, studying each vehicle. No headlights, no taillights, nothing but the ambient glow of the street lamps and the deep shadows they created. The second call came 18 minutes later at 3:05 a.m. This time I was ready for the sound, but that didn't stop my pulse from jumping. I let it ring twice before answering, some small act of defiance against the growing unease that had begun to crawl up my spine like cold fingers. It was the same voice, the same measured tone, the same message, almost word for word. Silver sedan, east lot, lights are on. Someone should check. When I told him I'd already looked and saw nothing, there was a pause so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he spoke again, and this time there was something underneath the calm, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. He insisted the lights were on. He could see them from where he was. He suggested I might need to get closer to see what he was seeing. I asked him where he was calling from. Another pause. Another soft click. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, hollow-eyed and pale under the harsh fluorescent glare. I looked like a man in an aquarium, suspended in artificial light while something in the darkness outside looked in. The thought made me turn away from the glass, made me check that the door was locked, made me wish there was something more substantial between me and the lot than a pane of glass and a flimsy lock. The protocol was clear. 2 suspicious calls about the same issue warranted police notification. I picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency line, explained the situation to the dispatcher, tried to keep my voice steady and professional. She assured me a unit would swing by within the next 20 minutes to do a welfare check. 20 minutes felt like an eternity wrapped in seconds. I tried to focus on paperwork, on anything that would keep my eyes away from the window, but I kept finding myself drawn back to the glass, searching the lot for movement, for anything that would explain the calls. The camera feed showed nothing. The lot remained still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the quality of the silence outside had shifted into something heavier, more expectant. At 3:31 a.m., headlights swept into the parking lot entrance. The police cruiser moved slowly, deliberately, its spotlight cutting through the dark like a blade. I watched on the monitor as it made its way to the east lot, the beam of light painting each vehicle in stark relief. The officer got out, tall and broad-shouldered, his hand resting casually on his belt as he walked between the rows of cars. That's when I saw them. 3 figures, dark shapes that had been invisible until the spotlight forced them into motion. They erupted from behind a panel van, sprinting toward the far fence with the desperate speed of animals flushed from hiding. The officer shouted something, his voice carrying faintly through the glass, and gave chase, though it was clear within seconds that they'd disappear into the residential area beyond the property line. My hands were shaking badly now, and I gripped the edge of the desk to steady them. 3 men, hiding in the lot, waiting for something. The implications crashed over me in a wave of nauseating clarity. The caller had wanted me to go out there, had wanted me to walk into the dark, alone and exposed, while they waited in the shadows. The officer returned 15 minutes later, slightly winded, and came directly to the booth. He explained what I'd already pieced together. They'd been lying in wait, using the phone calls to lure whoever was working the desk outside. When I asked if they'd caught anyone, he shook his head, said they'd need to increase patrols in the area, told me to keep the door locked and call immediately if anything else unusual happened. After he left, I sat in the booth and stared at my trembling hands. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow, shaky feeling in my limbs. I should have felt relieved. The threat was gone. The police were aware. I was safe in my locked booth with hours until sunrise and the arrival of the day shift. But I didn't feel safe. Because now, in the aftermath, questions began to multiply in my mind like bacteria in a petri dish. How had the caller known about the car? How had he seen lights that weren't there? Where had he been calling from to have such a clear view of the east lot? And most disturbing of all, why did his voice sound so calm, so utterly certain when he was lying? Unless he wasn't lying. Unless he had seen something I couldn't see. I forced myself to look at the security footage again, rewinding to just before the police arrived. I watched the empty lot, the still vehicles, searching for any sign of the 3 men before they ran. Frame by frame, I studied the shadows, the spaces between cars, looking for shapes that might have been human. And then I saw it. Or thought I saw it. A flicker in the darkness behind the panel van. Something that might have been movement, or might have been a trick of the compression artifacts in the digital recording. I rewound again, watched again, and this time I wasn't sure I saw anything at all. My eyes felt dry and scratchy. I'd been staring at screens for too long. That had to be it. Fatigue playing tricks on my perception. The phone rang at 4:12 a.m. I stared at it, watching it vibrate against the desk, and I knew with absolute certainty who it would be before I picked up. My hand hovered over the receiver, every instinct screaming not to answer, but the need to know overwhelmed the fear. I picked it up slowly, brought it to my ear, said nothing. The voice was the same, calm, measured, familiar now in a way that made my skin crawl. But this time the message was different. This time, he told me that the lights were still on, that they'd been on the whole time, that if I looked carefully, really carefully, I'd see what he meant. I told him the police had already been here, told him they'd chased away his friends, told him to stop calling. He asked what friends I was talking about, said he'd been alone the whole time, said he was just trying to help, trying to make sure I understood about the lights. Then he said something that made my blood crystallize in my veins. He said I should check the west lot instead, that he'd been watching from there all along. The line went dead. The west lot was directly behind the booth. I'd had my back to it for the entire shift. I spun in my chair, pressed my face against the back window, and looked out at the section of parking lot I'd been ignoring for hours. The same scattered vehicles, the same orange pools of light, the same emptiness. But now, knowing that someone might have been watching me from out there, the emptiness felt different, populated, full of eyes I couldn't see. I grabbed my flashlight, the heavy mag light I kept charged for the perimeter checks I was supposed to do every hour but usually skipped. My hands fumbled with it, and the beam wobbled when I finally got it on, sweeping across the interior of the booth in a drunken arc before I aimed it out the window. The light penetrated maybe 30 feet before dissolving into the dark. I couldn't see any silver sedan, couldn't see any car with its lights on, couldn't see anything but the ordinary geometry of the lot and its stationary inhabitants. But I could feel them, could feel the weight of observation, the pressure of eyes tracking my movement. It was irrational, I knew that, but knowing it didn't make it any less real. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, superimposed over the darkness beyond, and for a dizzying moment, I couldn't tell which side of the window I was really on. The logical explanation was simple. The caller was messing with me. Psychological warfare. Trying to frighten me after his plan had failed. The police had confirmed there were people out there, had chased them away. Everything could be explained without resorting to paranoia. But then why could I still feel them watching? I called the police again. A different dispatcher answered, and I explained about the new call, the threat, the feeling of being observed. She was professional, concerned, said she'd send the same unit back out. I thanked her and hung up, then realized I'd made a mistake. By calling them again, I'd done exactly what the caller might have wanted. I'd stayed inside, stayed frozen, while he had free reign of the lot. The thought made me stand up abruptly, the chair rolling back and hitting the wall. I needed to see. Needed to prove to myself that there was nothing out there but empty cars and overactive imagination. The camera feeds showed nothing, but cameras have blind spots. Cameras can be fooled. I unlocked the door. The night air hit me like a physical thing, cool and damp with the promise of rain. The sound changed immediately, the hum of the fluorescents replaced by the distant whisper of traffic on the highway, and the closer sound of my own breathing, loud and harsh in my ears. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes and the rough texture of the pavement. I walked toward the west lot, each step feeling like a small act of courage or profound stupidity. I couldn't decide which. The booth's light faded behind me, and the darkness grew more absolute, the orange sodium lamps creating as much shadow as illumination. Between the pools of light were stretches of pure black, and my imagination populated them with figures, with reaching hands, with eyes that reflected no light. The first row of cars revealed nothing. The second, the same. I was beginning to feel foolish, beginning to think about heading back when I saw it. A silver sedan. East lot, not west. Exactly where the caller had said. And its lights were on. Not the headlights, not the running lights or the hazards. But inside the car, the dome light glowed with a soft, steady luminescence, illuminating the empty interior. I approached slowly, the flashlight beam joining the dome light and pushing back the shadows. The car was locked. The windows were closed. There was no one inside, no sign of forced entry, no explanation for why the light would be on. I stood there staring at that small island of light in the vast darkness and felt reality begin to bend at the edges. The caller had been right. The lights were on. They'd been on the whole time, and I hadn't seen them from the booth, hadn't seen them on the cameras. Hadn't seen them until I'd come out here and looked with my own eyes. But how had he known? How had he seen what I couldn't see? Unless he'd turned them on himself. Unless he was still here. I spun around, flashlight sweeping in a panicked arc, and for just a moment I thought I saw them. 3 figures at the far edge of the lot, dark shapes that might have been human or might have been shadows cast by light poles. The beam of my flashlight couldn't reach that far, and by the time I'd fumbled with the focus, trying to extend its range, there was nothing there but empty space. The police arrived 8 minutes later, though it felt like hours. I was back in the booth by then, door locked, every light on, watching both the windows and the cameras with equal paranoia. The same officer as before approached, and I directed him to the silver sedan, watched on the monitor as he checked it, as he radioed something to dispatch that I couldn't hear. When he came to the booth, his expression was different, more serious, more concerned. He asked if I knew who owned the vehicle. I didn't. He asked if I'd touched anything. I hadn't. He said the car had been reported stolen 3 weeks ago from a location 40 miles away, and that finding it here, in this condition, with the interior light deliberately left on, suggested something beyond simple theft. He suggested it was bait. Another part of the trap. I asked him about the 3 men from before. Asked if they'd been caught or identified. He said no, that they'd vanished into the neighborhood, that there were no cameras in that direction, that without witnesses or evidence, there was nothing more they could do tonight except increase patrols and recommend that building management hire additional security. After he left, I sat in the booth and watched the sun rise, bleeding color back into the world by slow degrees. The stolen sedan sat in the east lot, now surrounded by police tape, ordinary and mundane in the growing light. The night shift supervisor arrived at 6, expressing concern about the incident, asking if I was okay, saying I could leave early if I needed to. I told him I was fine. Told him I'd finish the shift. Didn't tell him that I couldn't stop checking the windows, couldn't stop feeling that pressure of observation, couldn't stop wondering if the 3 figures the police had chased away were really the same ones the caller had been talking about, because the caller had never mentioned 3 men, had never mentioned anyone but himself, had spoken as if he were alone, watching alone, seeing things I couldn't see, and the car's interior light had been on, just as he'd said, had been on the entire time, in exactly the place he'd said it would be, though I hadn't been able to see it until I'd gone outside, until I'd walked into the dark, until I'd stood beside it and looked directly at its glowing dome. I left at 7, when the day shift took over. Drove home with the radio off, checking my mirrors more often than necessary, seeing patterns in the random distribution of traffic that probably weren't there. At home, I made coffee I didn't drink and stood at my window, looking down at the street below, at the parked cars and the empty sidewalks. Somewhere out there, a phone would ring. Someone would answer. A calm, measured voice would tell them about lights that were on, about things they should check, about dangers they couldn't see from where they were standing, and they'd have to decide whether to stay safe behind their locked door or step outside into the dark to see what was really there. I still don't know which choice is right. I still don't know if the lights I finally saw were the same ones the caller had been seeing all along, or if my walking out there had somehow made them real. I don't know if the 3 men were working with the caller or running from him. Don't know if they'd been waiting for me or fleeing from something else entirely. All I know is that tonight, I'm not scheduled to work. Someone else will sit in that booth, will answer the phone if it rings, will have to decide what to do when a calm voice tells them about lights they can't quite see. And I'll be at home, doors locked, curtains drawn, trying not to think about the missed call notification that appeared on my personal phone this morning, the one with no number attached, the one with a voicemail I haven't listened to yet, though I can guess what it says. The lights are on. They're always on. You just have to know how to look. Story 12. The fluorescent bulb behind the reception desk flickered with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, casting the lobby in alternating waves of sickly yellow and shadow. I'd been staring at that light for 3 hours now, watching moths spiral against the fixture in their endless, futile dance. My first solo shift at the Desert's Edge Motel, and already the silence felt thick enough to choke on. The previous clerk had quit without notice. The manager handed me the keys that morning with a look that suggested he knew something I didn't. But desperation makes you ignore warning signs. The pay was decent. The work seemed simple enough. Check people in, keep the coffee brewing, don't fall asleep. He'd mentioned the motel got quiet after 10. What he hadn't mentioned was how the quiet here felt different, how it pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. I'd been flipping through a water-damaged paperback someone had left behind when the headlights swept across the parking lot. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. A sedan, dark blue or black in the dim light, pulled into the space directly in front of the office. The engine cut out, but nobody emerged immediately. I watched the silhouette behind the wheel, waiting, my thumb marking my place in the book even though I couldn't remember a single word I'd read. When the car door finally opened, the man who stepped out moved with a strange, jerking quality, like someone fighting against invisible restraints. He wore a suit that might have been expensive once, now wrinkled and road-worn, the tie hanging loose around his collar. But what struck me first, what made my hand tighten on the book's spine, was the way he kept swatting at the air around his head. Sharp, violent movements, his hand cutting through empty space again and again as he approached the entrance. The bell above the door chimed as he pushed inside, bringing with him the smell of cigarette smoke and something else, something sweet and rotten that reminded me of fruit left too long in the sun. He stopped just inside the threshold, his hand frozen mid-swat, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from days without real sleep. "Need a room," he said, the words clipped and urgent. His free hand dove into his jacket pocket. I set the book down and pulled the register toward me, forcing my voice into something approximating professional courtesy. "Just for tonight?" Another swat, this one close enough to his face that I heard the whistle of air. He blinked hard, twice, as if trying to clear his vision. "Yeah, just tonight. Just need to..." He swatted again, harder. "Get some goddamn sleep." The registration process should have taken 5 minutes. It stretched to 15. He couldn't seem to focus long enough to fill out the card. Kept stopping to wave his hand around his head, near his ears, across his field of vision. When I asked if he was all right, if maybe he needed help with something, he looked at me with an expression caught between fury and pleading. "The flies," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "Can't you hear them?" I listened. The fluorescent buzz, the distant hum of the highway, the creaking of the building settling into the desert cold. No flies. It was October, nearly November. Too cold for flies at night, even out here. I told him I didn't hear anything, watched his jaw tighten as he resumed swatting at the empty air. When he finally finished the registration card, his handwriting was nearly illegible, the pen strokes jagged and desperate. I gave him the key to room 12, second floor, far end of the building. He snatched it from my hand with another violent swat near his face, and left without another word, the bell chiming his departure with a sound that felt too cheerful for the moment. Through the window, I watched him cross the parking lot. Even from here, I could see his hand moving, that constant swatting motion, as if he were walking through an invisible swarm. He disappeared up the exterior staircase, and I heard his footsteps overhead. My room sat directly below the second floor. The footsteps stopped. A door opened and slammed shut with enough force to rattle the coffee cups on their shelf. The silence that followed felt worse than before. I tried to return to my book but couldn't focus. Something about the man's movements, the genuine distress in his eyes, had worked its way under my skin. I found myself listening for sounds from above, tracking the creaks and groans of old wood and older pipes, trying to separate normal building noise from something else. Midnight came and went, the highway traffic thinned to nothing. I made a fresh pot of coffee, even though I was the only one who'd drink it, just to have something to do, some sound to fill the oppressive quiet. The smell of cheap grounds and hot water failed to cover that lingering sweetness he'd brought in with him. At 1:23 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, pacing, back and forth across the ceiling, a steady rhythm that spoke of agitation and building pressure. I counted his circuits, 12 lengths of the room before he stopped. Then silence again, but this time I couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing still up there listening, just as I was listening down here. The knock came at 2:17 a.m., not on the office door. Somewhere deeper in the building, the sound muffled by walls and distance, but still clear enough in the desert silence. 3 hard impacts, then silence, then 3 more. Harder. My hand found the phone receiver before I consciously decided to pick it up. Some instinct screaming that I should call someone, anyone. But who? And to report what? A guest knocking on a door? I set the phone down and moved to the office window instead, trying to see up to the 2nd floor, to get some glimpse of what was happening. The angle was wrong. All I could see was my own reflection in the glass, pale and uncertain in the flickering fluorescent light. The knocking stopped. Footsteps again, but different now. Slower, more deliberate, moving along the 2nd floor walkway, away from room 12. I pressed closer to the window, breath fogging the glass, and caught a glimpse of him moving past the exterior railing. That same suit, that same jerking motion. But he'd stopped swatting now. His hands hung at his sides, and even from this distance I could see his lips moving. He stopped in front of room 16, tried the handle. The door didn't open. Of course it didn't. The room was empty, unrented. But he didn't leave. He stood there, one palm flat against the wood, his mouth still working around words I couldn't hear. Then his voice drifted down, clear in the cold air. "I know you're in there. I can hear you. I can hear all of them." My throat went dry. I should have called the police then, should have done something, but I was frozen, watching this strange performance play out above me. He pounded on the door again 3 times, hard enough that I heard wood crack. "Let me in. I just want to help. I just want to make them stop." The words tumbled together, gaining speed and desperation. He tried the handle again, throwing his weight against the door. It held, but barely. That was when training finally overpowered paralysis. I grabbed the office keys and the small pocket knife I kept in my desk drawer. Not much of a weapon, but enough to make someone think twice, and headed for the stairs. The exterior walkway was exposed to the desert wind, which had picked up as the temperature dropped. It cut through my thin uniform shirt and made the metal railing ache with cold under my palm. He was still at room 16, now kicking at the base of the door with methodical determination. Up close, I could see his suit was covered in dark stains, could smell that sickly sweetness even stronger. I stopped about 10 feet away, keeping the knife in my sleeve where he couldn't see it, but I could reach it in a second. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Sir, that's not your room. Your room is 12. He spun toward me, and in that moment I saw something in his face that made every muscle in my body lock up. Not anger, not confusion, something more primitive. Recognition, maybe, or hunger. His lips were moving again, and this time I could hear the words, though they didn't seem directed at me. "Kill her, kill her, kill her, have to kill her before they do kill her." The pronoun barely registered in the moment. I was too focused on the way he was moving toward me now. That same jerking, fighting invisible restraints motion, his hand starting to swat at the air again. I let the knife slide down into my palm, not opening it yet, just letting the weight of it center me. "Sir, I need you to go back to your room, or I'm calling the police." He stopped, blinked, looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His hand rose, not in a swat this time, but reaching toward his own face, fingers trembling. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, smaller, confused, almost childlike. "Are they on me? Can you see them on me?" I forced myself to look at him. Really look. No flies, no insects of any kind. Just a man in a ruined suit with wild eyes and shaking hands, and words that made no sense tumbling from his cracked lips. I shook my head slowly, the knife still hidden in my sleeve, cold metal against my skin. "There's nothing on you, but you need to go back to room 12. Now." For a long moment, we stood there in the wind and the dark, staring at each other across the walkway. Then something in him seemed to deflate. He looked at his hands like he didn't recognize them, wiped his palm across his face, and nodded. Room 12, he repeated, the words slurred with exhaustion. Right. Sorry. I thought... He swatted again, just once, then caught himself. The flies get so loud sometimes. I watched him shuffle back down the walkway, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He fumbled with the key for nearly a minute before getting his door open. Didn't look back before disappearing inside. The lock clicked home with a sound that should have been comforting but somehow wasn't. I didn't return to the office immediately. I stood there on the walkway looking at room 16's door. No lights from inside. No one had rented it. But I found myself wondering what he thought he'd heard in there. What voices had drawn him away from his own room in the middle of the night. The wind picked up again, carrying with it that sweet rot smell, and for just a second I thought I heard it too. A low buzzing, like wings beating against glass. But when I turned, there was nothing. Just the empty parking lot and my own sedan and his dark vehicle and the desert stretching away into infinite black. The rest of the shift passed in a fog of hyper-awareness. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of settling wood convinced me he was moving again. I kept the knife on the desk next to the register, kept glancing up at the ceiling, kept expecting to hear footsteps. But there was nothing. Just silence, and that goddamn flickering fluorescent, and the taste of too much bad coffee coating my mouth. Dawn came slowly, bleeding across the horizon in shades of purple and gold. The highway started filling with morning traffic. Normal sounds, normal light, normal world reasserting itself. I'd almost convinced myself that the night had been some kind of waking nightmare, stress and isolation playing tricks on my perception, when I saw him again. He emerged from room 12 just after 7, looking somehow worse than he had the night before. The suit was more wrinkled, the stains more pronounced, and he was back to swatting at the air with renewed vigor. But what made my blood run cold was the way he moved directly to his car, threw his bag in the trunk and started the engine, all without ever looking toward the office, without checking out, without any acknowledgement that the previous night had happened. I watched him pull out of the parking lot and disappear down the highway, heading east toward the rising sun. His hand was still visible through the rear window, swatting at nothing. The manager arrived at 8 to relieve me. He took one look at my face and asked if everything had been all right. I almost told him about the man, about room 16, about the muttered words and the midnight knocking. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at me that first day, like he knew secrets about this place he wasn't sharing. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that telling would make it more real somehow, would force me to confront questions I didn't want to answer. So I just nodded, said it had been quiet, and handed over the keys. I drove home as the sun climbed higher, but I couldn't shake the night from my mind. That smell seemed to have worked its way into my clothes, my hair, my skin. I showered until the water ran cold, then lay in bed listening to the sounds of daytime. Cars on the street, neighbors talking, a dog barking 3 houses down. Normal sounds that should have been comforting, but felt strange after hours of silence. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing at that door, palm pressed against the wood, lips moving around words I shouldn't have been able to hear. Kill her, kill her, kill her. But there was no her in room 16. No one at all, unless. The thought crept in like cold water, slow and invasive. What if he'd been right? What if there had been someone in there, someone I couldn't see? What if the flies he'd been swatting at all night were just as real as the words he'd heard through that door? I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and that's when I heard it. Faint but unmistakable. A buzzing. Like insects caught behind the walls, trying desperately to get out. Or get in. I got up and checked every window, every door, every crack and crevice in my small apartment. Found nothing. But the sound persisted, rising and falling like breathing, always just at the edge of perception. When I stood still, it grew louder. When I moved, it seemed to follow. The next night, I called in sick. The manager sounded disappointed but not surprised. He'd probably seen it before. New hires who couldn't hack the isolation, the strange hours. The particular kind of loneliness that comes from watching over a place where people only stay long enough to sleep before moving on. He didn't ask questions, just told me to take care of myself and hung up. But I couldn't take care of myself because I couldn't escape the sound. It followed me through my apartment, through my car when I tried to drive somewhere, anywhere else. In the grocery store, I stood in the produce section and heard it emanating from the fruit. That same sweet rot smell suddenly everywhere I went. People passed by, chatting and laughing and living their normal lives, completely unaware of the insects I could now hear in every corner, every shadow. Or maybe I was the one who was unaware. Maybe I'd always been the one who couldn't see what was really there. I think about him sometimes, that man in the ruined suit with his wild eyes and swatting hands. I wonder if he's still driving east, still fighting off the flies that no one else can see. I wonder if he found what he was looking for in that empty room, or if the absence of it drove him further into whatever darkness he was fleeing. Most of all, I wonder about what he said. Killer, killer, killer. Was he talking about someone in room 16? Someone I couldn't perceive? Or was he talking about something inside himself? Some part that needed to die before the flies would finally leave him alone? I don't work at the Desert's Edge Motel anymore. The manager stopped calling after I missed 3 shifts in a row. Sometimes I drive past it late at night, see the flickering fluorescent in the office window, and wonder who's working the desk now. Wonder if they hear the buzzing too, or if they're still blissfully ignorant, still living in a world where flies are just flies, and silence is just silence, and a man swatting at empty air is just crazy. The knife is still in my pocket. I carry it everywhere now, a small weight that reminds me I once stood on a second-floor walkway in the cold desert wind and bluffed my way through a confrontation with a man who might have been dangerous, or might have been just as terrified as I was. I never opened it that night, never had to, but my hand finds it sometimes, closes around the worn metal casing, and I wonder what I would have done if things had gone differently, if he'd come toward me instead of retreating, if room 16's door had opened, if I'd looked inside and seen what he'd heard. The buzzing is constant now. I've learned to live with it, the way you learn to live with tinnitus or chronic pain, a background hum that never quite fades but becomes part of the baseline of existence. Some nights it's louder than others. Some nights I stand in my apartment and swat at the air, sharp, violent movements, knowing how I must look but unable to stop myself. Because maybe he wasn't crazy. Maybe he'd just been the first to notice. Maybe we're all covered in flies we can't see, all walking through swarms that only become visible when you've been alone too long, in the silence of a desert night, when reality gets thin and you can hear what's actually buzzing behind the walls of the world. Or maybe I should have never taken that job. Should have listened to the warning in the manager's eyes when he handed me those keys. Should have run the moment I saw that man in the parking lot, swatting at nothing, bringing his plague of invisible insects into the fluorescent glare of the lobby. But I didn't run then, and I can't run now. Because wherever I go, the flies follow. And sometimes, late at night when the world goes quiet, I hear them speaking, tiny voices in a language I almost understand, telling me things about doors that shouldn't be opened, and rooms that aren't as empty as they seem, and the thin membrane between what we can see and what's always been there, waiting. I never went back to find out if room 16 is still empty. I'm afraid of what I might find there now. Or worse, afraid that I might find nothing at all, and have to confront the possibility that everything I heard that night, everything I've been hearing since, comes from inside my own head. The flies are loudest when I think about going back. They're trying to tell me something. I just can't tell yet if it's a warning or an invitation. Story 13. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby above my head, that eternal drone that filled the space between closing time and dawn. 3:47 a.m. The digital clock on the register blinked red numbers into the darkness beyond our little bubble of harsh white light. Outside, the parking lot stretched empty and oil-stained under sodium vapor lamps that turned everything the color of old bruises. I shouldn't have been there. That's what I kept telling myself as I wiped down the counter for the 3rd time. the chemical smell of disinfectant burning the inside of my nostrils. My shift had ended at 2, but something had kept me there, some magnetic pull I couldn't quite name. The day manager had called in sick, and when the question hung in the air, who would stay? My mouth had answered before my brain could intervene. The drive-through window stood dark and silent now, that rectangular portal between our world and theirs. During the day, it was just a window. At night, it became something else. A frame for all the faces you'd rather not see. The ones that emerged from the darkness with eyes too bright and smiles that lasted too long. I'd learned to read them over the months I'd worked the late shift. The drunks with their slurred orders, the insomniacs seeking comfort in processed cheese, the night shift workers whose exhaustion hung off them like wet clothes. But there were others, the ones who pulled up to the window and just sat there, engine idling, staring. Not at the menu board, at us, at me. The tap on the glass made me flinch hard enough that I dropped the rag. She stood on the other side, the actual night manager, whose name tag read simply J, in letters that looked hand-scratched into the plastic. Her face was pale in the fluorescent wash, dark circles under her eyes so deep they looked like fingerprint bruises. "You should go home," she said through the glass, her voice muffled. "You should have left hours ago." I nodded, but my feet didn't move. There was something in her expression, something that reminded me of a rabbit I'd once seen frozen in headlights, every muscle locked in the knowledge of incoming impact. "What's wrong?" The question felt stupid the moment it left my mouth. She glanced over her shoulder at something I couldn't see, then back at me. Her hand came up to the glass, fingertips pressed white against the surface. "Did you see the car that came through around midnight? Silver sedan, tinted windows." I had. I remembered because the driver had sat at the window for nearly a minute after receiving his order, not leaving, not speaking, just existing in that liminal space. I'd felt the weight of his stare even though I couldn't see his eyes through the dark glass of his car. When he'd finally pulled away, it had felt less like driving off and more like a diver breaking surface, a violent return to movement after prolonged stillness. "He came back," she said, 3 times, just sitting there in the parking lot. The back of my neck prickled. "Did you call the police?" Her laugh was sharp and airless. "And tell them what? That a car is parked? That I feel watched?" She pulled her hand back from the glass, leaving behind 5 small fog patches from her fingertips. "They'd tell me what they always tell us, that he hasn't done anything. That feeling scared isn't evidence of danger." The clock clicked over to 3:48. Outside, nothing moved but the slight swing of a trash can lid in the wind, creating a rhythmic metallic clang that echoed across the empty lot. "I'm walking home tonight," she said. "My car wouldn't start. Battery's dead." Something cold slithered down my spine. "Let me give you a ride." "No." "Too fast, too sharp." "No, it's fine, it's only a mile. I've walked it before." I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat because underneath them lurked a thought I didn't want to examine too closely. I wanted to follow her, not to protect her, though that's what I tried to tell myself, but to watch, to see what happened next. The thought made my mouth taste like copper. She left through the back door at 4:15, after we'd finished the closing checklist in silence. I watched through the kitchen window as she crossed the parking lot, her jacket pulled tight despite the summer heat that still radiated off the asphalt. She moved quickly, purposefully, keys jutting from between her fingers like claws. I waited exactly 2 minutes before following. My car started with a rattle, the engine coughing into life. The sound felt too loud in the dead hour, like a shout in a library. I pulled out of the parking lot with my headlights off, telling myself I was being cautious, not predatory. The distinction felt important even as it dissolved under examination. She was already a block ahead, her figure silhouetted under streetlights that flickered and buzzed. I kept my distance, maintaining a gap that felt both too close and not close enough. The rational part of my brain screamed questions I couldn't answer. What was I doing? Why was I doing this? When had the decision been made? The sedan appeared at the intersection ahead, silver, tinted windows, sitting idle with its headlights off. It had been waiting, I realized. positioned at the exact cross street she would need to pass. My foot hovered over the brake, suspended between action and paralysis. She saw it. I watched her pace stutter, watched her hand dive into her pocket for her phone. The sedan's engine revved once, a predatory purr. Then it rolled forward, slow and deliberate, angling to cut off her path. I should have honked, should have accelerated, should have done something to break the tableau unfolding in front of me. Instead, I sat there, hands locked on the steering wheel, watching like I was viewing a scene through someone else's eyes. She bolted, not across the street, but back the way she'd come, straight toward me. The sedan lurched forward, and that's when my paralysis shattered. I hit my headlights and horn simultaneously, flooding the street with light and noise. The sedan stopped, tires chirping on asphalt. For one elongated moment, I felt sure I could see the driver's face through the windshield, but when I tried to focus on the features, they slipped away like oil on water. The sedan reversed sharply, then peeled out in the opposite direction, leaving rubber streaks and the acrid smell of burnt tire. I found her pressed against a chain-link fence 2 blocks back, phone clutched to her chest, whole body shaking. When my car pulled up, she flinched so hard I thought she might bolt again. "It's me," I called through the window. "From the restaurant. Are you okay?" Her eyes were wild, pupils blown wide. "Did you see him? Did you see his face?" I hadn't. The strange thing was, I couldn't remember if I'd actually looked, or if some instinct had kept my gaze averted, the way you might avoid looking directly at an eclipse. "Get in," I said. "I'll take you home." She hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw her calculation. Which was more dangerous, the devil she knew or the one who'd just fled? Then she climbed into the passenger seat, pressing herself against the door as far from me as possible. The drive took 7 minutes. She directed me in single words, left, right, there, until we stopped in front of a small duplex with peeling paint and a porch light that stuttered like a dying heartbeat. She had the door open before I'd fully stopped. "Thank you," she said, the words perfunctory, obligatory. Then she was gone, disappearing into the house with a speed that suggested she'd been physically pulled inside. I sat there for a moment, engine running, watching the lights in her windows flick on one by one. Then I drove home, taking a route that wound through empty streets that all looked the same in the pre-dawn darkness. Sleep didn't come. I lay in bed as gray light began seeping around my curtains, replaying the night frame by frame. The more I examined it, the less sense it made. Why had I followed her? The question circled like a vulture. I told myself it was concern, protection, vigilance. But underneath those justifications lurked something else. Something that had felt almost like compulsion, like I'd been pulled along by invisible strings. The following night, I called in sick. The night after that, too. But on the third night, I found myself driving past the restaurant at 2 a.m., slowing as I approached. The parking lot was empty except for 2 cars. One I recognized as belonging to Jay, the other. My hands went numb on the wheel. The other was a silver sedan with tinted windows. It sat in the far corner of the lot, positioned to have a clear view of the drive-through window. I pulled over a block away, killing my lights, and watched. Minutes stretched like taffy. Nothing moved. The sedan remained stationary, a predator in patient wait. At 2:45, a figure emerged from the restaurant's back door. Jay, jacket pulled tight, keys between her fingers. She scanned the parking lot, saw the sedan, and froze. Even from a block away, I could see the tension lock her body into stillness. The sedan's headlights flicked on. I don't remember making the decision. One moment I was watching, the next I was driving, accelerating hard toward the parking lot. The sedan didn't move as I approached. It just sat there, headlights blazing, as I pulled alongside it. Through the tinted glass, I could see nothing. Just my own reflection staring back, face pale and drawn, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. I rolled down my window, leaned out, about to shout. The face that looked back at me was my own. Not a reflection. The driver's window was down, and the man sitting behind the wheel had my face. My exact face. Same scar on the chin from a childhood fall. Same slightly crooked nose. Same pattern of stubble. He smiled at me, and it was my smile, the one I saw every morning in the bathroom mirror. "You should go home," he said with my voice. "You shouldn't be here." I tried to speak, but my throat had sealed shut. The doppelganger's smile widened, showing too many teeth, or maybe just the right number of teeth in all the wrong places. "She thinks you're following her," he said conversationally. "She told the police about a man in a dark car, described your car, your plates, you." "That's not..." My voice cracked. "I was trying to help." "Were you?" He tilted his head at an angle that should have hurt. "Then why did you park outside her house after dropping her off? Why did you sit there for 37 minutes before driving away?" I hadn't. Had I? The memory felt slippery, like trying to grasp smoke. I remembered driving home, but underneath that memory, another one surfaced. Sitting in my car, watching her windows, telling myself I was making sure she got inside safely, making sure the sedan didn't return. The minutes had stretched, 37 of them. "The first night," he continued, and now his voice had taken on a quality that seemed to come from inside my own head. "When you stayed late, why did you really stay?" "The day manager called in sick." "No one called. You volunteered. Before anyone asked. You wanted to be there when her shift ended." The parking lot tilted sideways. "No. You've been watching her for weeks, through the window. The way she tucks her hair behind her ear. The way she bites her lower lip when she's concentrating on the register. You know her schedule better than she does." "Stop. You followed her home that first night to protect her. That's what you told yourself. But you'd already looked up her address. You'd already driven past her house. Twice." I had. The memory surfaced with horrible clarity. 2 weeks ago, on my day off, driving through her neighborhood, slowing in front of the duplex, telling myself it was just a coincidence, just happened to be in the area, but I'd known the address. I'd found it somehow, though I couldn't remember how. "The sedan," I whispered. "The man who was following her." My doppelganger's smile became something that no longer resembled human expression. "Look at your car. Look at the color." I turned. My car sat under the parking lot lights, and in that sodium vapor glow, the dark blue paint I'd always known it to be looked different. Looked silver. Looked exactly like the sedan. "The tinting," he said. "You had it done last month. Don't you remember? So dark you can barely see through the windows. Because the sun hurts your eyes. That's what you told the shop. But really it was so no one could see in, so you could watch without being watched." My hands were shaking so hard I could hear my keys rattling. "This isn't real. You're not real. Neither are you." He leaned closer, and his breath smelled like antiseptic and old grease. "Not anymore. That's the point. You've been trying so hard to be the hero of this story, you never stop to wonder if maybe you're the monster." A scream cut through the air. Jay running toward a car across the lot. Not hers, I realized, but someone else's. A pickup truck I didn't recognize. A man I didn't recognize climbing out, putting himself between her and me, or between her and the other me, or... "You need to leave," the doppelganger said. "Before the police arrive," she called them. "They're 3 minutes out." "I didn't do anything. Didn't you? What did you really do that night you saved her? Did you see the sedan at all? Or did you just see yourself reflected in her fear?" The world fractured. 2 memories existed simultaneously. One where I'd been the rescuer, the good Samaritan who scared off a predator. Another where I'd been the predator all along, where my horn and headlights hadn't been a rescue but an escalation, where I'd terrified her into running toward me instead of away. "The window," he said. "You've been staring through it for so long you forgot which side you're on." Sirens in the distance growing closer. The man from the pickup truck was helping Jay into the vehicle, both of them looking at my car with expressions that registered pure fear. Not fear of the doppelganger, fear of me. "You should go home," my reflection said again, "while you still remember where that is." I drove. The streets blurred past in a wash of amber light and deep shadow. My car was definitely silver now, had maybe always been silver, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I couldn't tell if the face looking back was mine or his, or if there had ever been a distinction. Home. I needed to get home. But when I tried to picture it, my apartment, my street, my door, the images scattered like startled birds. Instead, I saw the restaurant, the eternal fluorescent lights, the drive-through window reflecting my face back at me, over and over, each iteration slightly wrong, slightly off, until I couldn't remember which one was original. The clock on my dashboard read 3:47 a.m. It had been 3:47 for the last 40 minutes, or perhaps just for 1 minute repeated 40 times. The distinction seemed important, but I couldn't grasp why. I found myself in a parking lot. My parking lot? Some parking lot. A McDonald's glowed ahead, and I couldn't remember if it was the one I worked at or a different one entirely. They all looked the same at night, didn't they? Same golden arches promising warmth and sustenance. Same fluorescent bubble of light against the darkness. A silver sedan sat in the corner of the lot, watching the drive-through window. I turned off my engine and sat in the darkness. Waiting for what? I couldn't say. For the next customer to arrive? For my shift to start? For someone to walk out that back door, keys between their fingers, afraid? The drive-through window stared back at me, dark and empty. Or maybe not empty. Maybe someone stood on the other side, looking out, seeing me the way I'd seen so many others. A face in the darkness, eyes too bright, smile lasting too long. The tapping on my window made me turn. He stood there, my reflection, my doppelganger, my other self. Or perhaps I was his. He gestured for me to roll down the window. When I did, he leaned in close, and I could smell the antiseptic and old grease that marked him as belonging to this place, to this eternal night shift. "You should come inside," he said. And it was definitely my voice now, or I had always been speaking with his. "Your shift started hours ago. She's been waiting for you." Through the restaurant's windows, I could see a figure at the register. Female, dark circles under her eyes, name tag that read simply, J. She was looking toward the parking lot, looking at me, or looking at him, or looking at whoever was really behind the wheel. "It's your turn at the window," he said. I understood then, or thought I did, or maybe understanding had stopped mattering somewhere along the way. The window worked both ways. Sometimes you served the customers. Sometimes you were the customer. Sometimes you were just a face in the darkness, watching and being watched, never quite sure which side of the glass you belonged to. The clock read 3:47 a.m. It would always read 3:47 a.m. The moment stretched infinite before and behind. And somewhere in that stretched moment, a silver sedan sat in a parking lot, and a man who might have been me watched a woman who might have been afraid, and neither of them could remember anymore if they were the hunter or the hunted, or if perhaps they had always been both, endlessly pursuing and pursued through an endless night that tasted like disinfectant and old grease, and the fluorescent hum of a drive-through window that reflected back only what you brought to it. I got out of my car. The asphalt was warm beneath my feet despite the hour. My doppelganger smiled and gestured toward the restaurant entrance. "Welcome back," he said. And I walked toward the light, because where else was there to go? The night stretched on forever, and somewhere in its depths, the real me was still driving home, still trying to remember which face was mine, still trying to understand when the watching had become the followed, and the followed had become the watching. The door chimed as I pushed it open. Inside, Jay looked up from the register, her expression unreadable. "You're late," she said. "I'm sorry," I replied, and I meant it, though I couldn't remember anymore what I was apologizing for. "I couldn't find my way." "Nobody can," she said. "That's the point." The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song, and I took my place behind the counter, and the night continued in its circular path, and somewhere outside a silver sedan waited in the darkness, and I couldn't remember anymore if I'd been driving it or running from it, Or if perhaps both things had always been true. The window reflected my face back at me, and I smiled. Because that's what you do when you can't remember which side of the glass you're supposed to be on. You smile, and you wait, and eventually someone else will pull up to the window, and the night will continue. It always does.